The lawyer's office was quiet except for the soft sound of the air conditioning and my grandmother tapping her nails on the big wooden table. I sat still, keeping my face calm, while Mr. Davidson, our family lawyer, finished reading my grandparents' will. When he was done, he adjusted his glasses and said, "As for our adopted granddaughter, Megan Mitchell, she will receive nothing from the estate because she is not related by blood. I am Megan Mitchell. At 28 years old, I was being cut out of my family's history just because I was adopted. It's nothing personal, dear," my grandmother Margaret said, though her smirk said otherwise. The Mitchell fortune must stay in the real family. Across the table, my cousins, Austin and Gloria, struggled to hide their excitement. The $40 million estate would now be mostly theirs, with smaller amounts given to other relatives. "I understand," I said quietly, gathering my things. "Is there anything else, Mr. Davidson?" The lawyer shook his head, looking uncomfortable. He had known me since I was a baby and had seen my parents raise me as their own. But now, with both of them gone, killed in a car accident 3 years ago, there was no one left to stand up for me. As I stood up to leave, my grandmother spoke again. "Oh, and Megan, you'll need to move out of the guest house by the end of the month. It belongs to the Mitchells." I turned to face her, meeting her cold blue eyes. Of course, I wouldn't want to intrude on the real family. The guest house had been my home for a year while I took care of my grandfather before he passed. My grandmother barely let me see him, always saying he was too tired or too sick. But during one of my rare visits, my grandfather had secretly given me something, a key and a note with an address. At the time, I didn't know what it meant. Now, as I walked out into the bright Texas sun, I pulled the crumpled note from my purse. The address led to a storage unit outside Houston. Underneath it, my grandfather had written in shaky handwriting, "Your mother left this for you. The real story is inside." My birth mother. I never knew her name. My adoption was closed and all records were sealed. My parents had only told me that she was young and wanted me to have a better life. I drove to the storage facility, my grandmother's words ringing in my head, "Not really part of this family." The place was old, nothing like the modern storage units in Houston. An elderly man sat behind the counter, reading a worn-out book. "Can I help you?" he asked. I showed him the key and address. "I'm looking for this unit. It was rented about 28 years ago." He adjusted his glasses and looked at the key. "Ah, Unit 247. Paid for 30 years in advance. You must be the daughter." My heart skipped a beat. "You remember?" He nodded. "Hard to forget. Young woman, about 20 years old, paid in cash. Said one day her daughter would come with the key. That must be you." "Yes," I whispered. "That's me." Unit 247 was at the back of the facility. My key fit perfectly, and the lock turned easily even after all these years. Inside, everything was neatly packed. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in careful handwriting. I opened the first box. It was full of papers, letters, documents, photographs. On top was an old envelope with my name on it. "My dearest Megan, if you're reading this, you found your way here. My name is Catherine Edwards, and I am your birth mother. But that's not the whole story. There's something you need to know about yourself and the Mitchell family." My hands trembled as I read on. Catherine Edwards had worked for Mitchell Industries in the early 1990s. She was smart, ambitious, and caught the attention of the CEO, my grandfather, Robert Mitchell. "The affair lasted 6 months," she wrote. "I was young and believed him when he said he'd leave his wife. When I got pregnant, everything changed. He saw me as a threat. He offered me money to go away, to have an abortion. When I refused, the threats began." The next box held proof, letters, recordings, bank statements. My grandfather had set up an entire plan. Catherine would give up her baby for adoption, tell no one who the father was, and disappear in exchange for money. I stared at the evidence, my whole life suddenly making sense. I hadn't been left out of the will just because I was adopted. I had been erased because I was a Mitchell by blood. The baby, me, was meant to be adopted by Robert Mitchell's son and his wife, who couldn't have children. "Your parents, John and Mary Mitchell, never knew the truth," Catherine wrote in her letter. "They were good people who wanted a child more than anything. Robert made sure everything looked like a normal adoption. They gave you the love and life I couldn't." But Catherine hadn't disappeared. For 28 years, she had been collecting proof, not just about my real father, but about the Mitchell family's darkest secrets. Corporate fraud, tax evasion, years of hidden crimes that built their fortune. I regret my part in all of this, she admitted. I was young and scared, and I let them control me. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped gathering evidence. Everything you need to prove who you are and what they've done is in these boxes. I sat for hours reading paper after paper. The truth was shocking. I wasn't just an adopted outsider. I was Robert Mitchell's granddaughter, more connected to the family than my cousins, Austin and Gloria. Some documents even suggested they might not be Mitchells at all. My phone buzzed. A text from my grandmother. Don't forget, end of the month. The guest house needs to be cleared out. I stared at the message, then back at the stacks of evidence. My grandfather's last gift wasn't just a key. It was the truth, and with it, the power to take back my place in the family. The question was, what would I do with it? For the next week, I sorted through every box. Catherine had been careful and incredibly smart. But the biggest shock came when I found a hidden compartment at the back of the storage unit. Behind a false panel, there was a laptop and stacks of hard drives, all labeled with dates. Catherine hadn't just collected evidence. She had continued tracking the family for years, using secret contacts and surveillance. My phone buzzed again, another text from my grandmother. The movers will be at the guest house tomorrow at 9 a.m. Be ready. I looked around my small living room, already packed up in boxes. For 3 years, I had lost everything. My parents, my place in the family, and now my home. But this time, I didn't feel helpless. For the first time, I had power. That night, I called the only person I could trust, Michael Chin, my father's old friend and the former CFO of Mitchell Industries. He had quit after my parents died, saying he couldn't be part of the company's corruption anymore. No one had believed him. Megan, he answered, his voice kind but worried. Are you okay? I heard about the will. I need your help, Uncle Mike. I said, using the name I had called him since childhood. Can we meet somewhere private? An hour later, I arrived at his house. His wife, Natalie, saw my face and didn't ask any questions. She just nodded and went to make tea. I spread the most important documents on Michael's dining table. As he read through them, his eyes widened. My God, he whispered. I knew they were hiding something, but this... He looked up at me. Do you understand what you have here? I nodded. Enough to destroy them. But I need your help to make sure it's solid before I take action. He picked up one of the hard drives. These financial records, they prove what I suspected when I quit. They've been stealing from the company's pension fund. If this falls apart, thousands of employees could lose everything. That's why we need to expose it now, I said. Before it's too late. Over the next few days, Michael helped me sort through the evidence. He brought in a forensic accountant and a lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud. Everything had to be airtight because the Mitchells wouldn't go down without a fight. At the same time, I moved out of the guest house. My grandmother sent an email to the whole family, proudly announcing that the adopted outsider was finally gone. She had no idea that I was spending my days meeting with federal investigators, SEC officials, and reporters, carefully preparing to expose everything. The files on Catherine's laptop revealed a tangled web of fake companies, hidden accounts, and illegal transactions. My grandparents weren't just protecting the Mitchell name. They were protecting a fortune built on lies and theft. One afternoon, as I was reviewing documents with Michael, my cousin Austin showed up at his house unexpectedly. Well, he smirked. Already planning your revenge, Megan? How pathetic. I calmly gathered the papers and put them in my bag. What do you want, Austin? Grandmother sent me with a message. Back off. Whatever you think you're doing, you won't win. I stood up, meeting his gaze. And what exactly am I doing, Austin? His smirk faded for just a second. We know you've been asking questions, meeting people. It stops now. Or what? I stepped closer. You'll cut me out of the will. Take my home. Oh wait, you already did that. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who didn't back down. Just remember who you're dealing with, he said, trying to sound threatening. The Mitchells know how to handle problems. After he left, Michael turned to me. They're getting nervous. We need to move faster. That evening, I got an encrypted email from one of Catherine's old contacts at Mitchell Industries. The company was about to announce massive layoffs to cover up the missing pension funds before anyone noticed. I made one last visit to the storage unit, gathering the final pieces of evidence. As I locked up, the elderly manager approached me. "Your mother left something else for you," he said, handing me an envelope. "She told me to give it to you once you'd had time to go through everything else." Inside was a single photograph. Catherine holding me as a newborn, tears on her face. On the back she had written, "Remember who you are. You're stronger than all of them." The day of reckoning arrived on a bright Monday morning. I sat in the Mitchell Industries boardroom, not as an outsider, but as the key witness in a federal investigation. At that same moment, FBI agents were raiding Mitchell properties across the country. SEC officials were searching company servers. And then my grandmother walked in, escorted by federal agents. For the first time, there was no smug smile on her face, just shock and disbelief. She looked at me sitting next to the lead investigator, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" my grandmother demanded, her voice shaking. "Megan, what have you done?" "Please take a seat, Mrs. Mitchell," the FBI agent said firmly. "We have questions about Mitchell Industries' financial activities." Austin and Gloria were brought in next, along with other family members and executives. One by one, they entered the room, their shock growing as they saw me sitting there. Their lawyer, already sweating, flipped through the thick file of evidence. Before the questioning started, I stood up. "There's something you all need to know." I pulled out the DNA test results we had run using samples from Catherine's storage unit. It turns out I am a Mitchell by blood. Grandfather made sure of that when he arranged my adoption, to cover up his affair with Catherine Edwards. The room exploded in chaos. My grandmother went pale as the truth sank in. Austin jumped up, shouting that it was all a lie, but the proof was undeniable. "That's impossible," my grandmother whispered. "Robert would never." "He did," I said calmly, "and then he spent the rest of his life watching you steal from the company he built. That's why he left me the key to Catherine's storage unit. He wanted me to expose the truth." For the next several hours, federal agents presented their case: pension fund fraud, tax evasion, and years of illegal activity. Catherine had documented everything, and now the Mitchell empire was crumbling. Gloria burst into tears. "You've ruined us," she shouted. "Your own family." I met her glare without flinching. "No, Gloria," I said. "You did that all on your own." "No," I said firmly. "You ruined yourselves. I'm just making sure the people you hurt get justice." The arrest came quickly. 15 family members and company executives were charged with fraud and other crimes. The company's stock crashed as the scandal made headlines, but I had planned for that too. With Michael's help, I worked with ethical investors to save the company. The stolen pension funds were restored by seizing hidden family assets, and a new leadership team took over. My grandmother and a few others took plea deals to avoid long prison sentences. Austin and Gloria fought the charges but were found guilty. The powerful Mitchell empire, built on greed and lies, collapsed in weeks. As for me, the court ruled that, as Robert Mitchell's biological granddaughter and the person who exposed the fraud, I was entitled to a large share of the recovered money. But I didn't want it. Instead, I created a foundation to support the employees who had lost so much. A year later, I stood in the lobby of what was once Mitchell Industries, now called Phoenix Technologies, watching employees walk in. The company had survived and was now thriving under honest leadership. "Your mother would be proud," Michael said, standing beside me. She spent years gathering evidence, hoping someone would finally reveal the truth. "Have you heard from her?" I asked. We had searched for Catherine after everything came out, but she had vanished. "No, but her lawyer sent this." He handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting I had seen on all her documents. "My dearest Megan, by now, you know the whole truth. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to help you, but you needed to find your own strength. I spent the last 28 years making sure you had the proof to fight this battle when the time came. I'll always regret giving you up, but watching you grow from a distance, I know I made the right choice by leaving you those files. You did what I never could. You held the family accountable for their crimes. I'm getting older now, and my job is done. Just know that I love you, and I'm so proud of you. You didn't do this for revenge. You did it for justice. You're everything I hoped you'd be, and more." With love, your mother, Catherine. I folded the letter, thinking about everything that had led me here. The Mitchells thought they could erase me, hide the truth, and get away with their crimes. Instead, they destroyed themselves. That evening, I visited the storage unit one last time. The elderly manager was still there, taking care of the place like always. Closing it out, he asked as I handed him the key. Yes, I said with a smile. The truth is finally out. Your mother knew you'd come one day, he said. Told me you were the kind of person who fights for what's right. As I drove home, I thought about family, not the one that abandoned me, but the one I had built. Michael and Natalie, who never stopped supporting me. The employees who trusted me to fix what had been broken. And Catherine, the mother I never knew, but who gave me the tools to uncover the truth. My phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Board meeting tomorrow. Ready to keep changing the world. I smiled and typed back a response. The Mitchells had believed that family was only about blood and power. They never understood that real legacy isn't about wealth or status. It's about doing what's right, no matter what. And in the end, the daughter they tried to erase became the one who saved everything they nearly destroyed.
My name is Lily Roberts, and if you had asked me a few years ago about my life, I would have told you it was a story of success and happiness. Now, as I sit here looking back, I realize it was more a tale of deceit and betrayal. It all started with the best intentions, but somewhere along the way, things went terribly wrong. I was 34 years old, working as a financial analyst at an investment firm in Austin, Texas. I was ambitious and dedicated to my job, always striving to do my best. My hard work paid off when I was promoted to senior manager. My life seemed to be on a perfect trajectory. I was living in a beautiful suburban home with my husband, Matt, who was 35 and working as a software developer. Matt and I had met at work. I had been assigned to train him when he joined the firm. Despite being younger, I held a higher position, which might have seemed intimidating to some, but Matt was always respectful and eager to learn. We quickly grew close, spending our lunch breaks together and talking about everything under the sun. Our connection deepened, and before long, we were inseparable. We married within 2 years, believing our love would carry us through anything. Our first few years of marriage were filled with joy. We enjoyed our new home, hosted gatherings with friends, and dreamed of the future. But as time went on, cracks began to appear. Matt's career was not advancing as he had hoped. He was frustrated with his job, feeling overshadowed and unappreciated. I, on the other hand, was thriving. My promotions and accolades at work were becoming more frequent, and my success only seemed to highlight Matt's struggles. I noticed a shift in Matt's attitude. He started coming home late more often, his phone constantly buzzing with messages he was quick to hide. At first, I chalked it up to work stress. But as weeks went by, his behavior became more erratic. He was always secretive about his plans and frequently mentioned his sister, Hannah, who had moved to Austin not long before. Hannah was in her early 30s and was, to put it mildly, a piece of work. She had a commanding presence and a knack for getting what she wanted. Her arrival in our lives was marked by an unusual intensity. She began making frequent demands on Matt, asking for money under various pretexts, which Matt was always eager to provide. I initially tried to be accommodating, wanting to be supportive of Matt's family. However, it soon became clear that Hannah was not just a casual visitor. She was manipulative and assertive, often showing up unannounced and making demands that left me feeling uncomfortable. I remember one evening when she dropped by and demanded $10,000 to help with a business venture. Matt handed over the money without consulting me, which infuriated me. I had never been averse to helping family, but this seemed excessive and sudden. Despite my growing concerns, I chose to document each transaction meticulously. I knew that having a clear record might be important if things ever went south. I started keeping a detailed log of the money given to Hannah, noting the dates and reasons she provided. It was a precautionary measure, something that seemed sensible given the growing tension in our home. As Matt's resentment towards my career success grew, he began pressuring me to consider leaving my job. He argued that my demanding position was affecting our marriage, but I suspected there was more to it. His frustration seemed more than just work-related. It was almost as if he was projecting his own insecurities onto me. One day, as I was preparing for a presentation, I overheard a conversation between Matt and Hannah. They were whispering, and I couldn't catch all the details, but the tone was unmistakably conspiratorial. It struck me that their relationship was more than just sibling support. It seemed like a full-blown alliance against me. By this time, I had been promoted to senior manager. It was a milestone I had worked hard for, and while I was thrilled, Matt's reaction was less than supportive. He grew distant and irritable. Hannah, ever the opportunist, began making more frequent demands for money, now citing personal emergencies and family issues. Her requests totaled over $60,000, and Matt's willingness to comply was becoming increasingly unsettling. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. Matt's new routine of coming home late, avoiding eye contact, and taking secretive phone calls became the norm. He was spending more time with Hannah, and their combined influence over him grew stronger. I was left to deal with a growing sense of betrayal and isolation. Despite all this, I tried to stay patient. I knew that confronting Matt too early could backfire. Instead, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation, all while trying to manage my work responsibilities and maintain a semblance of normalcy at home. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. As I navigated these choppy waters, I kept reminding myself that I needed to stay focused. I was determined to find out what was really going on and to protect myself from the growing storm that seemed to be brewing around me. I never imagined that life could unravel so quickly. The situation at home with Matt and Hannah was getting worse, and I was barely keeping it together. My work at the investment firm was becoming a refuge from the chaos at home, but the pressure was mounting on all fronts. As I continued to document the money Hannah was demanding and observe Matt's increasingly erratic behavior, I realized that something needed to change. One day, I received a call from my boss. The news was bittersweet. I was being promoted to senior manager. I was excited about the opportunity, but I also felt a heavy weight in my chest. Matt's resentment had been growing, and I knew that this new role might push him and Hannah further away. Matt's reaction to the promotion was exactly what I feared. He was cold and distant, barely congratulating me. Instead, he seemed more interested in how this would affect him. Hannah's response was even more unsettling. She showed up at our house the day after I announced the promotion and demanded $15,000 for what she claimed was a critical investment opportunity. The timing was too convenient, and I couldn't ignore the sense of dread creeping over me. I didn't have to wait long for the confrontation I had been preparing for. A week after the promotion, Matt came home in a particularly foul mood. He was more irritable than usual and snapped at me over the smallest things. That night, he finally exploded. "You don't get it, Lily," Matt shouted. "Your job is the reason we're falling apart. You're never around, and Hannah and I are left to deal with everything on our own." I was taken aback. I had tried to be understanding, balancing my career with my responsibilities at home. But Matt's outburst was more than just frustration. It was a culmination of all the resentment he had been harboring. I knew Hannah had a hand in this. She had been fueling Matt's dissatisfaction with my success. Things reached a breaking point when I discovered that Matt and Hannah were planning a secret trip. They were always looking for excuses to be together, and their actions were becoming more suspicious. I decided to follow Matt one evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was really going on. I tailed him to a cafe on the outskirts of town where he met Hannah. I couldn't hear their conversation clearly, but I saw them exchanging what looked like a stack of money. My heart sank as I realized that they were up to something. The evidence of their betrayal was piling up, and I knew I had to act. My first move was to check the security footage from our home. To my dismay, I saw Matt and Hannah sneaking around, rifling through our belongings. They were looking for something specific, but I couldn't figure out what. Their behavior was increasingly brazen, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. I decided it was time to make a strategic move. I confronted Matt the next day, but he was defensive and evasive. I told him that I knew about the money and the secret meetings with Hannah. He denied everything and accused me of not trusting him. It was clear that his loyalty was with his sister, not with me. Despite his denials, I knew I needed to protect myself. I started preparing for the worst, gathering all the evidence I could find, documents, emails, and notes. I also began consulting with a lawyer to understand my options and to plan for any legal battles that might arise. The real turning point came when Matt and Hannah made their move. They had planned a lavish getaway, using my credit card information to fund it. I had suspected something was amiss, so I decided to take a preemptive measure. I swapped my credit card with an old membership card from a local fitness club. When Matt and Hannah tried to use the card for their trip, their plans were thwarted. They ended up stranded in Minneapolis during a harsh winter. I had hoped this would be a wake-up call for Matt, but it only seemed to escalate the situation. During their trip, I received a call from Chris, Hannah's husband. He was shocked by the developments and revealed that he had been unhappy in his marriage as well. Chris had become an unlikely ally, and together, we began to strategize our next steps. I was ready to face Matt and Hannah, but I knew I had to be careful. The groundwork had been laid, and I was prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. My patience and meticulous planning were about to pay off, but the real challenge was just beginning. I remember the day Matt and Hannah came back from their disastrous trip like it was yesterday. They walked through the front door, their faces etched with frustration and defeat. The once familiar look of triumph in their eyes had been replaced with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. I had been waiting for this moment, my heart pounding with both anticipation and dread. Matt was the first to speak. "Lily, he began, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to come up with an excuse. He glanced at Hannah, who was trying to regain her composure, but her nervous fidgeting betrayed her. "I've had enough of your lies and deceit," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "I know all about the credit card and your plans. I've been documenting everything, and I have all the evidence I need." Matt's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. Hannah, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly snapped. "You have no idea what you're talking about. We've been through enough already. You don't need to make things worse." I took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment I had prepared for. "I know you were planning to use my credit card for that trip, and I've already replaced it with an old membership card. You ended up stranded because of that. And I've also been in touch with Chris." At the mention of Chris, Hannah's face contorted with a mix of anger and fear. "Chris?" she demanded. "What's he got to do with this?" "Chris and I have been talking," I said calmly. "He's been struggling with the same issues, and he's seen what you've done. He's ready to stand with me against both of you." Matt and Hannah exchanged a look of panic. "You're going too far, Lily," Matt said, trying to regain his composure. "This is all just a misunderstanding. We can work this out." I shook my head. "No, Matt. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is betrayal, and I'm done with it. I've already consulted with my lawyer, and I'm ready to file for divorce. I'm also demanding repayment of the $60,000 you borrowed and compensation for the emotional damage you've caused." The silence that followed was heavy. Matt's eyes were filled with disbelief, while Hannah looked like she was about to crumble. "You can't be serious," Hannah said, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't really do this." "I've never been more serious," I replied. "You've made it clear that you have no respect for me or my boundaries. I'm done being manipulated and deceived. I'm taking control of my life." Matt finally broke down, his facade cracking. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad." "But you did let it get this bad," I said firmly. "And now there are consequences." The confrontation wasn't just a turning point, it was a cathartic release. The weight of the deceit, the anger, and the hurt that had been building up inside me was finally being addressed. I was taking a stand, and it felt empowering. As Matt and Hannah processed what was happening, I could see the realization dawning on them. They were trapped, with their schemes exposed and their plans falling apart. Matt's attempts to apologize and explain seemed futile against the overwhelming evidence I had gathered. Later that day, I met with Chris. He had been a surprising ally in all this, and his support meant a lot. We discussed the next steps and agreed that our focus should be on making sure the legal proceedings were handled thoroughly. Chris was also preparing to confront Hannah, and the prospect of both of us moving forward without the weight of deceit was a small comfort. The legal paperwork was prepared, and I felt a sense of resolve as I signed the divorce papers. I was reclaiming my independence, and with each step I took, I felt stronger. The confrontation with Matt and Hannah was not just about ending a relationship. It was about reclaiming my life and moving toward a future where I was no longer a victim of deceit and manipulation. But even as I took these steps, the situation wasn't fully resolved. There were still challenges ahead, and I knew that the path to moving on would be fraught with complications. The road to independence was long, but I was ready to face whatever came next with the strength and determination that had carried me this far. The weeks following the confrontation were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional upheaval. The divorce papers were filed, and every day seemed to bring a new challenge. Matt and Hannah fought back, but their efforts were futile against the mountain of evidence I had gathered. The court process was grueling, but I was determined to see it through to the end. One crisp morning, I sat in my new apartment, the one I had bought with the money from the settlement. It was a sleek, modern condo in downtown Austin, and I felt a surge of pride as I looked around. It was a symbol of my newfound independence and the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Chris had been a steady support throughout this period. His own separation from Hannah had been painful, but he was handling it with grace. We had become close, finding solace in each other's company and mutual understanding. Our shared experiences had forged a bond between us that was more than just friendship. He had been instrumental in ensuring the legal process went smoothly and had been a beacon of support when I needed it most. As I settled into my new condo, the final court hearing approached. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but I knew that this was the last hurdle to overcome. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with a sense of resolve. I was ready to close this chapter and start afresh. The courtroom was tense, filled with the echoes of legal jargon and the hushed whispers of spectators. Matt and Hannah were present, their faces a mix of anxiety and resentment. I could feel their eyes on me, but I focused on the judge and the proceedings. The hearing went as expected. The judge reviewed the evidence, listened to the arguments, and made a ruling. I was granted the divorce, and Matt was ordered to repay the $60,000 along with additional compensation for emotional damages. It was a relief to hear those words, but it was also a validation of everything I had fought for. As I walked out of the courtroom, a sense of closure washed over me. I had faced the deceit and manipulation head-on, and I had emerged victorious. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led me to a place of strength and self-assurance. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work with renewed energy. My promotion to regional director was officially announced, and I embraced the new role with enthusiasm. It was everything I had worked for, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as I stepped into my new position. Chris and I continued to support each other, and our friendship grew stronger. We shared our victories and challenges, finding comfort in knowing we were not alone in our struggles. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a recognition of the battles we had fought and the strength we had gained. The finality of the divorce and the resolution of the financial matters were freeing. I was no longer tied to the deceit and manipulation of my past. The weight that had burdened me for so long was lifted, and I felt like I could finally breathe. As I looked out over the city from my new condo, I reflected on how far I had come. The journey had been fraught with difficulties, but it had also been a path of personal growth and empowerment. I had faced betrayal and deceit, and I had emerged stronger and more self-assured. My life was no longer defined by the manipulations of others. I had reclaimed my independence and found a new beginning. The future was bright, filled with opportunities and the promise of new experiences. I was ready to embrace whatever came next with the confidence and strength that had carried me through this transformative period. In the end, the story of my life was one of resilience and empowerment. I had faced deceit and manipulation head-on and had triumphed. It was a testament to the strength that comes from standing up against betrayal and the power of reclaiming one's life and future. I remember the first time I met Mark. It was at an art exhibition in Paris, of all places. I was 28, still feeling like I was discovering who I wanted to be. Mark was everything I thought I wanted, charming, confident, and so full of life. He swept me off my feet with his grand gestures, his stories of traveling, and his genuine admiration for my passions. It felt like a fairy tale. We married within a year of meeting. Looking back, I realize now how naive I was. At first, our life together was as magical as I had hoped. Mark's affection never seemed to wane. He was always surprising me with flowers or spontaneous dinners. I was working part-time at a bookstore, which I loved. It gave me time to read and explore my own interests while still contributing to our household. But as time went on, things started to change. Shortly after we got married, Mark's demeanor began to shift. The charming man I had fallen for was replaced by someone who was demanding and lazy. He began to treat me less like a partner and more like a caretaker. His freelance photography career, which had seemed so exciting at first, became unstable. He would jump from one project to another, never sticking with anything for long. And as his career faltered, so did his motivation. I was pressured into quitting my job at the bookstore. Mark insisted I stay home, saying it was the best for our family. I gave in, thinking that maybe he knew better. But as I stayed home, taking care of our son, Leo, and managing the household, it became clear that Mark wasn't contributing at all. He'd spend days on end lounging around, leaving me to juggle all the responsibilities. Our marriage began to crumble under the weight of his neglect and my growing resentment. Leo was 8 years old by then, full of energy and curiosity. I did my best to make his life as normal as possible, despite the tension at home. Mark barely interacted with him, leaving me to handle everything from school pickups to bedtime stories. It felt like I was living in a constant state of exhaustion, trying to keep our family together while feeling like I was losing myself. The turning point came in the form of a severe traffic accident. I was on my way to the grocery store when a car hit me. I remember the pain and confusion vividly. I was rushed to the hospital, and the injuries were serious. I spent weeks there, unable to move much, the whole time feeling abandoned. Mark's behavior during this time was shocking. He didn't visit me for weeks. When he finally did, it wasn't to comfort me. Instead, he criticized me for not being able to handle household chores and blamed me for everything that was going wrong. It was then that he demanded a divorce. His words stung, but deep down, I wasn't surprised. I had been thinking about ending our marriage for some time, but I was waiting for the right moment. I had already suspected that something was off in our marriage. I had discovered Mark's affair with a woman named Sophie. I found love letters hidden in his studio. They were filled with affection and promises, things I had once thought were meant for me. The pain of that discovery was immense, but it also gave me clarity. I hired a private investigator to gather evidence, and what he uncovered was even worse than I had imagined. The photos and recordings of Mark and Sophie together were proof of his betrayal. With all this evidence, I felt a mix of sadness and determination. When Mark finally pushed for the divorce, I agreed without hesitation. He was taken aback by my swift response, but I was ready. The financial dependency I had felt for years was about to change, and I was no longer willing to stay in a marriage that had become so toxic. Then came the unexpected call from my father, Robert. He and my mother were retiring from their luxury boutique chain in Paris, and they wanted to transfer their assets to me. $10 million. The news was overwhelming, but it also gave me a sense of liberation. For the first time, I felt truly free to make decisions for myself without being financially tethered to Mark. Soon after, another accident, this time, a car hitting me, left me bedridden for months. My time in the hospital was a blur of pain and recovery, and Mark's indifference only made things worse. When he visited, his focus was solely on finalizing the divorce. I handed him the papers, and he signed them without a second thought. Living with my parents while I healed was a comfort. The support they provided was a balm to my wounded spirit. I knew I was making the right choice, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. The sense of freedom I felt was tempered by the challenge of rebuilding my life from the ground up. As I lay in bed, recovering from the accident, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led me to this point. I was determined to reclaim my independence and rebuild my life, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Little did I know the real test was just beginning. Life after the accident was a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. I was still in the hospital, my body slowly mending from the injuries, when I made the decision to finally move forward with the divorce. Mark's visits were sporadic and cold, often more about finalizing the paperwork than about showing any real concern for me. His attitude only reinforced my resolve to break free from the toxic relationship. I remember one particularly difficult day. I was lying in bed, my body aching with every movement, when the hospital room door opened. Mark walked in, his expression as indifferent as ever. "How are you feeling?" he asked, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Still in pain," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark nodded, but his next words were a harsh blow. "I need you to sign these papers. We need to finalize everything. I've got things to do, you know." He thrust a stack of documents at me, barely glancing at my face. It was as if my suffering was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to him. I took the papers with trembling hands and signed them, my heart heavy with the weight of finality. I had already prepared myself for this moment, but it was still a painful realization of how far we had fallen. As I was preparing to leave the hospital and move in with my parents, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and apprehension. My parents, Robert and Linda, were waiting for me at their home, eager to help me recover and support me in any way they could. Their home was a stark contrast to the environment I had left behind, warm, loving, and filled with the reassurance that I wasn't alone in this. I spent several months recuperating at their house. Every day was a struggle, but it was also a chance to rebuild my strength and my spirit. During this time, I tried to focus on myself and my future. My father's unexpected gift of financial independence was a beacon of hope. I knew it was my chance to start over, to take control of my life and find my own path. As I started feeling better, I began to think about what I wanted to do with my newfound freedom. Returning to graphic design had always been a dream of mine, but I hadn't had the opportunity to pursue it fully. Now, with the financial security my parents' gift had provided, I could finally consider it seriously. One day, while I was still recuperating, I received a call from Mark. His voice on the phone was hesitant, almost pleading. "Emma, can we talk? I know things ended badly, but I've been thinking a lot lately." I was taken aback. "What do you want to talk about?" "I know I made a mess of everything," he said, his tone surprisingly contrite. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I want to make things right." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "You want to make things right now?" After everything you've done? Mark's silence on the other end was heavy. I know I messed up, but I didn't realize how much until it was too late. Sophie, she isn't what I thought she'd be. She's not like you. His words stung, but they also confirmed what I already knew. His second marriage was falling apart. I wasn't sure what Mark expected from me, but I had no intention of going back to the life I had left behind. I appreciate the apology, I said, my voice steady. But I'm not interested in revisiting our past. I've moved on. And you still have responsibilities, alimony, and child support that need to be settled. Mark's response was a mixture of frustration and desperation. Emma, please don't do this. I need you to understand that I regret everything. I hung up the phone feeling a mix of relief and sadness. I had hoped for closure, but his call only reminded me of why I had made the decisions I did. It was clear to me that Mark's actions had been driven more by regret than by any real understanding of the pain he had caused. As I continued to heal and reflect on my life, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. The freedom and financial security my parents' gift had given me were transforming into a renewed sense of purpose. I was determined to use this opportunity to rebuild my life on my own terms, to embrace my independence and reclaim my self-worth. Little did I know, the journey ahead would test my resilience in ways I had never imagined. But I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to overcome it all. By the time I was fully recovered, I had settled into a new routine with my parents, and my life was beginning to take on a sense of normalcy again. My father's unexpected gift had given me more than just financial security. It had given me the chance to dream and rebuild. I decided to use this opportunity to return to my passion, graphic design. With the resources available to me, I could finally take the leap I had always wanted. I started small, taking on freelance design projects from home. It was a slow start, but each project reminded me of my capabilities and my love for the creative process. My parents were incredibly supportive, and their encouragement was a comforting constant in this new phase of my life. One evening, as I was working on a design project in the cozy living room of my parent house, the phone rang. It was Mark again. His voice, this time, was filled with frustration. Emma, I need to talk to you. It's about Leo. I took a deep breath before answering. What's going on? There's been a problem with Sophie, Mark said, his voice wavering. She's not managing things well, and I'm struggling to keep up with everything. I need your help with Leo. I was taken aback. Help with Leo? You've been absent for so long, and now you want to involve me? I know, Mark said quickly. I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to fix them. I just don't know how to manage everything with Sophie falling short. His words were frustrating. Mark, I've moved on from this life. Leo deserves stability, but I can't just drop everything to fix your problems. Mark's response was desperate. Please, Emma. I'm at my wit's end here. I need you to help us work something out for Leo's sake. I was torn. My first instinct was to protect my son from any further disruption, but I also knew that I had my own life to rebuild. I agreed to meet with Mark to discuss Leo's situation, but I made it clear that any involvement would be on my terms. The meeting was uncomfortable. Mark looked exhausted, and Sophie was nowhere to be seen. Emma, thank you for coming, Mark said as we sat down in a small cafe. I'm trying to make things right, but I need your help. I studied him, seeing the weariness in his eyes. What exactly do you need? We need a better arrangement for Leo, Mark explained. He's been asking about you and seems unsettled. I'm struggling to manage his needs, and Sophie, she's just not fitting into the role of a mother. The reality of the situation was hard to ignore. Leo was caught in the middle of a broken family, and despite everything, I knew I had to be there for him. All right, I said, trying to stay calm. I'll help coordinate some arrangements for Leo. But this needs to be done properly, with clear boundaries. Mark nodded, visibly relieved. Thank you, Emma. I appreciate it. We worked out a plan that included regular visits and clear communication about Leo's needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I had no illusions about Mark's intentions or his ability to handle everything perfectly, but I needed to ensure that Leo's well-being was prioritized. As the weeks passed, I found a rhythm in my new life. My freelance work picked up, and I began to feel a sense of accomplishment and purpose. I was finding joy in my work and comfort in the love and support of my parents. My relationship with Leo improved, and seeing him happy and thriving brought me a sense of fulfillment I had missed for years. Mark's situation with Sophie continued to unravel, but I remained focused on my own path. It was clear that Mark's problems were far from over, but I chose not to dwell on them. My priority was to be a supportive mother and to continue building a future for myself and Leo. One evening, as I watched Leo playing in the park, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey to this point had been filled with challenges and pain, but it had also been a path to rediscovery and empowerment. I had faced my fears, stood up for myself, and embraced a new beginning. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was learning to navigate it with strength and resilience. I knew that the road ahead would have its own set of challenges, but I was ready to face them head-on. My story was far from over, and I was determined to make the most of every opportunity that came my way. The months following the divorce and the new arrangement with Leo were a whirlwind of adjustment and growth. I had settled into a new rhythm, finding solace in my work and the simple pleasures of life. It was during this period that I received a call that was both surprising and unsettling. Mark, who had been relatively quiet after the divorce, reached out again. "Emma, can we talk?" he asked, his voice strained. I agreed to meet him, curious about what he wanted this time. We met at a quiet cafe in Paris, a place where we had once shared happier moments. Mark looked older and more worn out than I remembered. "Emma," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm in trouble. Sophie and I, things didn't work out. She's left, and now I'm facing financial difficulties. I've realized how much I messed up, and I need your help." I listened, feeling a mix of emotions. "Mark, what are you asking of me?" "I'm asking for a chance," he said. "I know I was wrong. I've been trying to reach out to you because I've realized what I lost. I need to make things right, and I'm not sure how to do it alone." I took a deep breath. "Mark, I've worked hard to rebuild my life. I've found stability and purpose, and I can't let your problems derail that. But I do want to make sure Leo is okay. What exactly do you need?" "I need help with the financial obligations," Mark admitted. "I can't keep up with the child support and alimony payments. I'm struggling, and I don't know how to manage it all." The request was difficult to hear. I had always known that Mark's decisions would have consequences, but hearing him admit his struggles was a stark reminder of the reality he was facing. "Mark," I said, "I've been doing everything I can to provide for Leo. I can't take on more than I already have. You need to find a way to manage your responsibilities." Mark's face fell, and he looked defeated. "I understand. I wanted you to know how sorry I am. I've made so many mistakes, and I see now how much I hurt you and Leo." His apology was too little, too late. "Mark, I appreciate your honesty, but actions speak louder than words. You need to take responsibility for your actions and face the consequences." As we parted ways, I felt a sense of closure. Mark's struggles were his own to deal with, and while I sympathized with his situation, I couldn't let it affect my own progress. I had worked hard to create a new life for myself and Leo, and I wasn't going to let anything jeopardize that. Life continued to unfold, and I found joy in the simple things, working on design projects, spending time with Leo, and enjoying the support of my parents. My relationship with Leo grew stronger, and I was grateful for the stability we had found together. One day, as I was working at the bookstore, a familiar face walked in. It was an old friend from my past, someone I hadn't seen in years. We caught up over coffee, and I shared my journey with her. She listened attentively, offering support and encouragement. "You've come so far, Emma," she said. "It's inspiring to see how you've turned your life around." Her words were a comforting reminder of how much I had accomplished. The road hadn't been easy, but I had navigated it with determination and resilience. I had faced my fears, rebuilt my life, and found strength in my own abilities. As I looked back on my journey, I saw it as a testament to the power of self-worth and perseverance. The story of my life was one of overcoming adversity and finding empowerment in the face of challenges. I had learned that true strength comes from within and that embracing one's own value is the key to personal growth and happiness. The future remained uncertain, but I was ready to face it with confidence. My story was a continuous journey, and while the road ahead might have its own set of obstacles, I knew that I had the resilience and strength to navigate whatever came my way. I've always believed that our lives can be marked by moments of unexpected clarity. For me, one such moment came when I was just about to walk down the aisle. I'm Emily Jones, a 29-year-old boutique manager in Chicago, and as I reflect on the journey that brought me here, I can't help but think about the pivotal role my family played, especially my brother, Michael. Growing up, Michael was my rock. He was 7 years older than me and always seemed to have everything figured out. I remember him as a protective and caring big brother, someone who would stand up for me no matter what. He was a successful real estate developer in Los Angeles, a city known for its glamour and fast pace. Michael had always worked hard, and despite his demanding career, he made time for his family, especially me. Our parents were loving and supportive, but Michael's success often made him the focal point of our family gatherings. I was never jealous, though. I admired him for his achievements and his unwavering support. He had this way of making you feel safe and cherished, and it was no different when it came to my life decisions. When I got engaged, I was thrilled to share the news with my family. My fiancé and I had been dating for a few years, and he had recently proposed in the most charming way. It felt like the perfect start to the next chapter of my life. I knew I wanted Michael and his wife, Jessica, to be a part of it. They were coming to Chicago for the engagement dinner, and I couldn't wait to introduce them to my fiancé. Jessica was a beautiful woman, stunning in fact. She had been a former actress before becoming a full-time housewife. From what I had seen, she was glamorous and sophisticated, but there was something about her that never quite sat right with me. Maybe it was her obsession with material things, or the way she often seemed detached from family events. Regardless, Michael loved her deeply, and that was enough for me. I wanted to make a good impression and hoped that Jessica would be as excited about the wedding as I was. The evening of the engagement dinner, the atmosphere at the restaurant was electric. My fiancé was charming, and our families were mingling and celebrating the upcoming nuptials. Michael and Jessica had flown in earlier that day, and I was looking forward to seeing them. But when they arrived, Jessica was noticeably absent. "Where's Jessica?" I asked Michael when he greeted me with a warm hug. "She's on her way," Michael replied with a forced smile. "She got caught up with some last-minute errands. She'll be here soon." I didn't think much of it at the time. The evening continued smoothly, filled with laughter, toasts, and happy conversations. It wasn't until after the dinner, when I received a phone call from Jessica, that things started to take a turn. "Emily," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "I can't believe you didn't bring me any of the sweets from the hotel where the dinner was held. I heard they have the best pastries." I was taken aback. "Jessica, you didn't even come to the dinner," I reminded her. "Why would I bring you sweets?" She huffed on the other end. "Well, I just thought you would. It would have been a nice gesture." Her call was a stark reminder of her self-centered attitude. It was as if the celebration was only important if it served her interests. I could tell that Michael was trying to keep the peace, but I knew that his wife's behavior was a source of stress for him. The next day, while I was working at the boutique, a familiar face walked in, Jessica. She was with a younger man who looked vaguely familiar, but whom I couldn't place. Jessica introduced him as a former colleague from her acting days. They were chatting like old friends, and I couldn't help but notice how casually Jessica was interacting with him. She was asking for discounts on various items, which was odd since she was known for her extravagant taste. Even more unsettling was the way she let the young man pay for her purchases. It was as if she was treating the boutique as her personal shopping spree, with no regard for the small business that was trying to serve her. I was disturbed by what I saw and felt a strong urge to tell Michael. But how would he react? The last thing I wanted was to cause trouble, especially given how much he was already dealing with. I debated whether I should say anything, but deep down, I knew I had to be honest. Michael deserved to know the truth, even if it meant confronting some uncomfortable realities. As I continued with my day, my thoughts were consumed by the realization that something was deeply wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the surface was only the beginning of a much darker story. The way Jessica had acted, her disregard for our engagement dinner, her behavior at the boutique, made me question her loyalty and integrity. Little did I know, these suspicions would soon lead to revelations that would shake our family to its core and test the very essence of our bonds. But for now, all I could do was brace myself for what lay ahead, knowing that the truth might be even more painful than I had imagined. It was a sunny afternoon in Chicago when I decided to confront Michael about what I had seen. I had spent days wrestling with the decision, but I knew it was important. Michael had always been there for me, and now I needed to return the favor. I hoped that sharing my observations about Jessica might help him address any issues in his marriage. I called Michael and asked if we could meet up at a cafe nearby. "Of course," he said. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something, too." When we met, I could see the stress etched on his face. We ordered coffee and found a quiet corner. As soon as we were settled, I took a deep breath and started, "Michael, I saw Jessica at the boutique the other day." His eyes widened slightly. "Oh, what happened?" I recounted the events as honestly as I could. She was with a younger man, someone she introduced as a former colleague. They were shopping and she was asking for discounts. The man paid for her items. It just fell off. Michael's expression grew troubled. "I see. I'm sorry you had to witness that. I've been aware of Jessica's behavior for a while now, but I've been so consumed with work that I haven't been able to address it." My heart sank as I listened to him. "Michael, you deserve to be in a relationship where you feel valued and respected. I think you need to have an honest conversation with Jessica." He nodded, though he looked exhausted. "I know. But there's something else I need to tell you. It's important." Before he could elaborate, I noticed how weary he looked. The conversation ended with a promise from Michael to consider what I had said and to address the situation with Jessica. I left the cafe feeling both hopeful and anxious about the future. A few weeks later, the news hit hard. Michael had been diagnosed with stomach cancer. The diagnosis was a shock, and the doctors explained that it was a result of years of stress and overwork. Michael's condition deteriorated quickly, and he decided to spend his remaining time focusing on his family and his legacy. During this period, I could see Jessica's behavior becoming even more erratic. She seemed more interested in shopping and social events than supporting Michael through his illness. It was painful to watch. Despite the strain on our family, Michael's focus remained on setting things right before he left us. As Michael's health worsened, he made arrangements to meet with me. His voice was weak, but his determination was clear. "Emily, I've made some decisions regarding my estate," he began. "I want to ensure that everything is taken care of." I listened attentively as he explained that he had already distributed his wealth. He had set aside $80,000 for me, specifically for my wedding. The rest of his assets were allocated to various charities and friends who had supported him throughout his life. Michael's plan was to ensure that Jessica would receive nothing from his estate. "I know this might come as a surprise," Michael said, "but I wanted to protect what was important to me and to you. I'm sorry I couldn't do more." I was overwhelmed with emotion. Michael had always been generous, and his decision to support me while leaving Jessica with nothing was both heartbreaking and revealing. I understood why he had made the choice, given Jessica's behavior and the impact it had on him. A few months later, Michael passed away, and the funeral was an emotional affair. Jessica's conduct was shocking and disrespectful. She showed up wearing a diamond necklace that clearly hadn't come from Michael's wealth and spoke openly about her expectations of inheriting a fortune. Her comments were jarring and insensitive, especially given the circumstances. I was left grappling with the reality of Michael's decisions. His will had been clear, and the estate was indeed distributed as he had planned. Jessica was left with nothing but debts and disappointment. The contrast between her expectations and the harsh truth of her financial situation was striking. In the days following the funeral, Jessica's desperation became apparent. She attempted to claim any part of Michael's estate, but it was all gone, used up in charitable donations and gifts to close friends. She was left facing a reality far different from the luxury she had anticipated. I felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. My brother's passing had left a void, but his decisions had revealed the depth of his character. As Jessica's struggles became public, I was determined to honor Michael's memory by focusing on the values he had instilled in me, values of loyalty, love, and integrity. In the end, I realized that Michael's choices were not just about money, but about preserving the principles that mattered most. His actions spoke louder than words, and as I moved forward with my life, I knew I had to stay true to those principles, despite the challenges that lay ahead. The days following Michael's funeral were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. The initial shock of his passing had begun to settle, but the reality of his decisions was hitting hard. Jessica's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and desperate. She had always been about appearances, but now, her attempts to salvage her lifestyle seemed almost pathetic. It didn't take long for the news of Michael's will to spread. Jessica's attempts to access Michael's estate had been fruitless. She had discovered that the assets had been depleted, donated to charities, and given to Michael's close friends. It was a harsh wake-up call for someone who had expected a lavish inheritance. One afternoon, I received a call from Jessica. Her voice was strained, and there was a sense of urgency in her tone. "Emily, can we talk?" she asked. "I really need your help." I was taken aback, but agreed to meet her at a local cafe. When we sat down, Jessica's appearance was striking. She looked disheveled, a far cry from the glamorous persona she had always maintained. Her eyes were red from what seemed like days of crying. "Emily, I don't know where to turn," Jessica began, her voice trembling. "Michael's will. Everything is gone. I'm left with nothing. I need help." I listened as she explained her situation. She had been forced to sell her mansion and was now struggling to pay off mounting debts. Her once luxurious lifestyle was rapidly disintegrating, and she seemed genuinely overwhelmed. Despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Losing Michael had undoubtedly been devastating, and the subsequent financial collapse was another blow. "You know, Jessica," I said cautiously, "Michael had his reasons for what he did. He wanted to make sure that his legacy was about more than just money. He cared about the people who supported him." Jessica's eyes narrowed, and she looked away. "I know he had his reasons, but it doesn't make this any easier. I thought he would leave me something, anything." "I'm sorry," I said. "I wish I could do more to help, but everything was distributed according to Michael's wishes. It's been a difficult time for everyone." Jessica sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "I understand. I just wish I had known earlier. I wouldn't have wasted so much time on frivolous things." Despite her words, it was clear that Jessica was struggling to come to terms with her new reality. I could see the cracks in her facade, and while part of me wanted to offer support, I couldn't forget the way she had treated Michael and the rest of the family. As weeks went by, Jessica's situation continued to deteriorate. She had to take on multiple jobs, something she had never imagined herself doing. It was a stark contrast to the life she had led before. She even reached out to me a few more times, asking for advice on how to manage her debts or find additional work. Each time, I offered as much support as I could, but the reality was that her financial woes were beyond what I could resolve. My life was moving forward, too. I was busy planning my wedding, an event that was both joyful and bittersweet. Michael had been so excited about it, and his absence was deeply felt. Yet, as I prepared for this new chapter, I tried to focus on honoring his memory by staying true to the values he had embodied: kindness, generosity, and integrity. One evening, as I was going through wedding preparations, I received a call from Jessica. Her voice was calmer than before, and there was a resignation in her tone. "Emily, I'm calling to thank you. I know I haven't been the best to you, but your kindness has been appreciated." I was surprised by her change in tone. "Jessica, I'm glad you're finding some stability. I hope things improve for you." "Thank you," she replied. "I've learned a lot through all this. I'm trying to make things right, to be better." Her words seemed sincere, and while I remained cautious, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand the deeper lessons in Michael's decisions. As the wedding day approached, I felt a mix of emotions. Michael's absence was a profound loss, but his legacy of love and responsibility was guiding me through this time. Jessica's struggles were a reminder of the consequences of valuing material things over genuine connections. The days went by, and life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. As I walked down the aisle on my wedding day, I thought of Michael and the impact he had on my life. I was determined to live by his example, cherishing love and loyalty above all else. Jessica's journey was still unfolding, but I hoped that she would eventually find a way to rebuild her life with the lessons she had learned. For me, the focus was on moving forward, honoring Michael's memory, and embracing the values he had stood for. The story was far from over, but the lessons learned from Michael's choices and Jessica's challenges would stay with me forever. As time went on, the weight of Michael's loss continued to be felt, but life had a way of pushing us forward. I was determined to honor his memory and the values he held dear. The wedding had been a poignant event, filled with joy, but also marked by his absence. It was a bittersweet celebration, but I found solace in knowing that I was making choices that would make him proud. Jessica's life, meanwhile, was a constant reminder of the harsh realities of prioritizing wealth over meaningful connections. She continued to struggle with her financial situation, and though she reached out occasionally, her situation seemed to be a continuous uphill battle. I often wondered if she would ever find peace or redemption. One day, as I was going through some old family photos and mementos, I stumbled upon a letter from Michael that he had written to me before his passing. In it, he expressed his love and pride for me and shared some final thoughts about his decisions and his hopes for the future. Reading his words, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Michael had always been a guiding light in my life, and even in his absence, his wisdom was still guiding me. He had written about the importance of living a life true to oneself, about valuing genuine relationships over material possessions, and about making the most of every moment. I made a promise to myself to live by those principles. My life was changing, and I wanted to ensure that I was staying true to the values that Michael had instilled in me. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed to be reaching a breaking point. She called me one day, her voice more subdued than I had ever heard it. "Emily, I've hit rock bottom. I'm doing everything I can to make ends meet, but it's not enough. I need help, and I don't know where to turn." I could hear the desperation in her voice. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't turn my back on her. Michael had always been about family, and while Jessica's actions had hurt deeply, I knew that turning away now would only perpetuate the cycle of bitterness. I agreed to meet her at a small cafe downtown. She arrived looking tired and worn, her usual polish replaced by a look of exhaustion. We talked for hours about her struggles and the things she wished she had done differently. It was a difficult conversation, but it was also cathartic. Jessica seemed to be coming to terms with her mistakes and was genuinely seeking a way to rebuild her life. "I've realized," she said quietly, "that I need to change. I've been so focused on what I've lost that I haven't seen what I can still gain from starting over." I nodded, understanding the weight of her realization. "It's a tough journey, Jessica, but sometimes starting over is the only way to truly move forward." Michael wanted us to cherish what we have and learn from our experiences. We parted ways with a sense of tentative hope. I knew that Jessica's road to recovery would be long and difficult, but I hoped that she would find the strength to rebuild her life and learn from her past. As for me, I continued to embrace the values that Michael had taught me. I worked hard, not just in my career but also in my personal life, striving to be a source of support and kindness for those around me. My marriage was a source of joy, and I made sure to nurture it with love and respect. Life continued to unfold with its ups and downs, but through it all, I kept Michael's memory alive in my heart. His lessons about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth guided me every day. I found fulfillment in giving back to the community, supporting those in need, and staying true to the principles that mattered most. Jessica's journey was a sobering reminder of the consequences of valuing material things over genuine relationships. Her struggle and eventual attempt to turn her life around were a testament to the hard truths of life and the possibility of redemption. In the end, the story of Michael, Jessica, and me was one of learning and growth. It was about understanding the true meaning of wealth and the importance of valuing what really matters: love, family, and integrity. As I looked back on everything that had transpired, I felt a sense of peace knowing that I was living a life that honored Michael's memory and the lessons he had left behind. The journey was far from over, but with each step, I was guided by the values that Michael had cherished. And as I faced the future, I did so with the knowledge that even in the midst of challenges, there was always a chance for renewal and growth. I'm Nancy, a 32-year-old assistant professor at the University of Chicago. My life seems pretty sorted now: academic achievements, a supportive network, and a city that's become my home. But the truth is, my past is a tangled mess that still shadows my present. Sometimes, it feels like I'm on the edge of a deep chasm, looking back into a childhood I'd rather forget. I remember my early years vividly, living in a cozy house in a small town in Indiana with my parents. Those were the days when my world was full of laughter, warmth, and the comfort of knowing I was loved. My mother was the center of my universe. She was kind, wise, and had an unspoken way of making everything better. My father was a loving husband and a good dad, but after my mother's unexpected death, everything changed. When she died, it was like the ground had been ripped from beneath us. I was only 15, and the loss was unbearable. My father was devastated, and I could see how grief consumed him. In his overwhelming sorrow, he didn't have the strength to comfort me. Instead, he sought solace elsewhere and soon brought Catherine into our lives. Catherine was not just a stranger. She was cold, manipulative, and abusive. I remember the day she first walked into our house. I was sitting on the porch steps, clutching a worn-out book, trying to make sense of the world. Catherine stepped out of the car with an air of arrogance that made me uneasy. My father was visibly relieved, perhaps hoping that she would fill the void left by my mother's absence. But for me, her arrival marked the end of my childhood happiness. Catherine wasted no time making her presence felt. She didn't need to shout or be overtly cruel. Her mere presence created a chilling atmosphere. It started with small things: her disdainful comments, her ability to turn even the smallest incident into a dramatic affair. The house that once echoed with laughter became a place where every corner seemed to harbor tension. It wasn't long before her cruelty escalated. Catherine would go out of her way to torment me. I remember how she ruined my belongings, my favorite books, my cherished toys, even my clothes. The damage was always subtle enough to be dismissed as accidents. But the worst was the physical pain she inflicted, always in ways that were easy to hide. I learned quickly that no matter how much it hurt, I had to keep silent. I tried to reach out to my father for help, but he refused to see the truth. When I told him about Catherine's behavior, he would get angry and dismiss me as being ungrateful or imagining things. He had become so enmeshed in his grief and Catherine's manipulative charms that he couldn't, or wouldn't, see the reality of the situation. I remember one particular incident vividly. Miss Jenkins, my teacher, had noticed the bruises on my arms and the sadness in my eyes. She approached me gently, asking if everything was all right. I was terrified. Catherine's threats had instilled a deep fear in me, and I couldn't risk angering her further. I lied, saying everything was fine, even though I was far from okay. Things reached a breaking point when Ms. Jenkins decided to intervene. She contacted my father and arranged a meeting at school. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would see reason and take action. Instead, when my father arrived, he accused me of lying and punished me further by locking me in my room. The emotional wound of being disbelieved by the one person who was supposed to protect me was deeper than any physical pain. Desperate and with nowhere to turn, I made a decision that would change everything. I reached out to my grandmother, who lived in Chicago. She had always been a beacon of love and safety in my life. Her home was a stark contrast to the hostility of my childhood. I wrote her a letter, pouring out my heart, hoping she would understand the gravity of my situation. When my grandmother received the letter, she didn't hesitate. She came to Indiana, confronting my father and demanding that I be allowed to live with her. Despite Catherine's protests and my father's reluctance, my grandmother's love and determination prevailed. It was the first time in a long while that I felt a glimmer of hope. Packing up my belongings and leaving that house felt like stepping out of a nightmare. I was leaving behind the place that had been both my home and my prison. Moving to Chicago was like waking up to a world where love was real and safety wasn't just a fleeting dream. I had escaped the clutches of Catherine's cruelty and my father's indifference. I was moving towards a future where I hoped to heal from the scars of my past. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, a chapter that would force me to confront my past head-on and find the strength to stand up for myself. Moving to Chicago marked the start of a new chapter in my life. My grandmother's house was like a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing down on me. Her home, filled with warmth and the smell of freshly baked cookies, was everything my childhood home had not been. My grandmother, Margaret, was in her late 70s, but her spirit was as vibrant as ever. She had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. Her home was a cozy, two-story house on a tree-lined street with a garden full of colorful flowers and a swing set that reminded me of happier times. From the moment I arrived, it was clear that my life was about to change. Margaret welcomed me with open arms, and her love was like a balm to my wounded heart. She listened patiently as I recounted the horrors I had endured, never once doubting me or brushing off my pain. For the first time in years, I felt heard and understood. Despite the warmth of her home, adjusting to life in a new city was challenging. Chicago was bustling and loud, a far cry from the quiet town in Indiana where I had grown up. I had to navigate a new school, new friends, and a new routine. But Margaret was my constant support, and her presence made the transition smoother. One of the first things I did was enroll in the local high school. It was daunting to start over, but I was determined to make the most of this fresh start. The school was big, and I felt like a small fish in a vast ocean. But Margaret encouraged me to join clubs and make friends, which helped me slowly adjust to my new life. Despite the new environment, there were moments when the past would creep back in. The fear of Catherine's retaliation never completely left me, and there were nights when I would wake up, drenched in sweat, reliving the worst moments of my life. But Margaret's soothing presence and gentle words helped me find the strength to face those fears. My grandmother's support went beyond emotional comfort. She made sure I had everything I needed to succeed academically and personally. She helped me with my homework, encouraged me to pursue my interests, and even took me shopping for new clothes. Her generosity and kindness were a stark contrast to the neglect I had experienced before. Despite the nurturing environment, there were times when I felt overwhelmed. I was carrying the weight of my past while trying to build a future. Margaret's unwavering support gave me the strength to push through, but there were moments when the trauma felt like an insurmountable barrier. Things seemed to settle down, and I began to find my footing. My grades improved, and I started to make friends who accepted me for who I was. But just as I was starting to feel stable, a new challenge emerged. My grandmother fell ill. It was a sudden and severe illness that required hospitalization. The news was a blow. Margaret had always been my rock, and seeing her in a hospital bed was a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be. I spent countless hours at her bedside, praying for her recovery and trying to stay strong despite the fear and uncertainty. During this difficult time, my father and Catherine reappeared in my life, this time with a different agenda. They reached out to me, seeking to claim my grandmother's house and the inheritance she had left behind. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I had thought that the worst of my past was behind me, but now I faced a new battle. The thought of losing the only stable home I had known since leaving Indiana was terrifying. Catherine and my father were relentless. They tried to manipulate the situation, claiming that Margaret's will was invalid and demanding access to the house and the $500,000 inheritance left to me. Margaret's condition worsened, and I had to focus on her well-being while trying to handle the legal mess that had suddenly become part of my life. I sought help from legal advisors to understand my rights and the best way to protect what was rightfully mine. It was a difficult time, balancing my grandmother's care and fighting against my father and Catherine's claims. The emotional strain was immense, and I often found myself on the edge of breaking down. Yet, amidst all this turmoil, I found strength in Margaret's teachings. She had always been a fighter, and her resilience became my guiding light. Every day, I would visit Margaret, read to her, and talk about the good times we had shared. I hoped that my presence would give her some comfort and strength, even as I struggled with the external pressures. My grandmother's illness was a stark reminder of how precious and fragile the things we hold dear can be. As I navigated these challenges, I realized that the true battle was not just against my father and Catherine, but against the lingering shadows of my past. It was a struggle to reclaim my sense of self, my right to a stable and safe life, and to honor the memory of the person who had always been my beacon of hope. The fight was far from over, but I knew that with Margaret's strength and my own growing resilience, I could face whatever came next. As my grandmother's health deteriorated, the battle for the house and the inheritance became more intense. The stress of managing her illness while dealing with my father and Catherine's demands was overwhelming. It felt like I was fighting a war on two fronts, one to save Margaret's life and the other to protect what she had left me. My father and Catherine were relentless. They began by threatening legal action, claiming that Margaret's will was invalid due to some obscure technicalities they had discovered. They argued that the house and the $500,000 inheritance were rightfully theirs. The stress of these constant threats and legal maneuvers felt like a never-ending storm cloud hanging over me. Margaret's hospital room became a place of refuge and despair. I would sit by her bed, clutching her hand, and try to keep her spirits up. It was hard to see her so frail, her once vibrant energy now diminished. Despite my best efforts, I could feel the weight of my past and the current pressures crashing down on me. But I refused to give up. Margaret had always been my pillar of strength, and I was determined to honor her legacy by standing up for myself and her wishes. The legal battles were exhausting. I hired a lawyer, Mr. Jacobs, who specialized in estate disputes. He was compassionate and understood the emotional toll the situation was taking on me. He guided me through the complexities of the law, preparing documents and evidence to defend my grandmother's will. Mr. Jacobs explained that the inheritance and the house were legally mine, as long as we could prove the validity of the will and defend against the challenges from my father and Catherine. Every day, I would juggle hospital visits with meetings with Mr. Jacobs. It was a grueling routine, and there were times when I felt like I was on the brink of collapse. The pressure was immense, and the legal threats from my father and Catherine seemed to grow more aggressive. One afternoon, while going through Margaret's belongings in the house, I found a hidden envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Margaret addressed to me. It was a powerful and emotional message that revealed a lot about her thoughts and intentions. In the letter, she spoke of her love for me, her pride in my accomplishments, and her wish for me to stand strong despite the challenges I faced. Margaret had anticipated the possibility of conflict and had left specific instructions on how to handle any legal disputes. The letter included details about her will and the reasons behind her decisions. It was a reminder of her strength and her unwavering belief in my ability to overcome adversity. The letter became a source of strength for me during this tumultuous time. It reaffirmed my commitment to protect her legacy and uphold her wishes. With the letter in hand, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was clear that Margaret had prepared for this, and her words gave me the resolve I needed to continue fighting. I met with Mr. Jacobs to discuss the new evidence and strategize our next steps. The letter was a crucial piece of evidence that demonstrated Margaret's clear intentions and her understanding of the potential challenges. The legal proceedings became more intense. My father and Catherine used every trick in the book to undermine our case. They hired their own lawyers, who tried to discredit Margaret's will and question my credibility. It was a painful and humiliating process, but I refused to back down. Throughout this period, I leaned heavily on my support system. Friends from the university, colleagues, and even former teachers offered their encouragement and assistance. Their support was invaluable in helping me maintain my sanity and stay focused on the battle at hand. Despite the emotional and physical exhaustion, there were moments of light. Margaret's condition showed small improvements, and she was occasionally able to communicate with me, even if just through gestures. Her presence, even in her weakened state, was a reminder of the love and strength that had guided me through so much. One particularly pivotal moment came when Mr. Jacobs managed to arrange a mediation session with my father and Catherine. The goal was to reach a settlement and avoid a lengthy court battle. I hoped that a direct conversation might lead to an understanding or resolution. During the mediation, emotions ran high. My father was visibly agitated, and Catherine's cold demeanor remained unchanged. I presented the letter from Margaret, along with other evidence, to reinforce our position. The letter had a profound impact on the proceedings. It was clear that Margaret's wishes were legally and emotionally compelling. The mediation ended with no immediate resolution, but the session made it evident that my father and Catherine were aware of the strength of our position. They seemed to reconsider their approach, realizing that continuing the battle might not be in their best interest. As I left the mediation room, I felt a mix of hope and apprehension. The battle was far from over, but I had taken significant steps to defend Margaret's legacy. The struggle had tested my limits, but it had also revealed my inner strength and resilience. The fight for the house and the inheritance was far from over, but I knew that with Margaret's guidance, Mr. Jacobs' expertise, and my own determination, I could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The past had shaped me, but it was the present and the future that I was determined to protect and build. The culmination of the legal battles came sooner than I expected. Despite the challenges, my determination and Margaret's letter played a crucial role in turning the tide. The mediation session had shaken my father and Catherine, and their once aggressive stance began to waver. It became clear that continuing their fight was not only futile, but could also further damage their reputation. One crisp autumn morning, Mr. Jacobs called with some surprising news. My father and Catherine had decided to settle out of court. They had agreed to withdraw their claims on the house and the inheritance in exchange for a modest financial settlement. It was not the outcome I had originally hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless. The house and the inheritance would remain mine, and I could finally put the past to rest. The settlement agreement was finalized and the legal documents were signed. As I walked through the empty rooms of Margaret's house, I felt a profound sense of closure. The house, once a battleground of my past traumas, now represented my resilience and the love Margaret had given me. I knew that moving forward, I had the power to shape my own future. Margaret's passing was a deeply sorrowful event. Her death left a void in my life that no one could fill. Yet, her legacy lived on through the strength she had instilled in me and the lessons she had taught me. I organized a small ceremony to honor her memory, inviting close friends and family who had supported me through the trials. It was a poignant and emotional moment, reflecting on the journey we had shared. With the house now securely in my possession, I made it a priority to transform it into a place of healing and peace. I spent time renovating and decorating, creating a home that honored Margaret's memory while reflecting my own growth and independence. Each room I restored felt like a step toward reclaiming my sense of self and moving beyond the shadows of my past. One evening, while sitting in the sunlit living room, I thought back on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the battles, the triumphs, it all seemed like a distant memory compared to the tranquility I now felt. I realized that I had come full circle, from a frightened child trapped in an abusive environment to an empowered woman who had reclaimed her life. My father and Catherine eventually faded from my life. Their influence diminished. They had made their choices, and their actions had consequences. As for me, I had learned that I could not control the actions of others, but I could control how I responded to them. The lessons I had learned from Margaret and the strength I had discovered within myself were invaluable. I continued my work at the University of Chicago, where my experiences added depth and empathy to my teaching. My past had shaped me, but it had also fueled my desire to help others and make a positive impact. The stories of resilience and overcoming adversity that I shared with my students were rooted in my own experiences, and it was fulfilling to see them find strength in their own journeys. The house in Chicago became a symbol of my personal victory. It was no longer just a place of memories. It was a testament to the power of standing up for oneself and the importance of perseverance. Each time I walked through its rooms, I was reminded of the love and strength that had guided me through the darkest times. The story of my life is not just one of hardship and struggle, but also of triumph and transformation. It's a story of finding strength in adversity, embracing the love that surrounds us, and ultimately creating a future that reflects our true selves. I had faced betrayal and heartache, but I had emerged stronger and more resilient. As I look back, I realized that the journey wasn't just about fighting for a house or inheritance. It was about reclaiming my sense of self and honoring the memory of those who had truly cared for me. The final chapter of the story is not just about the battles won, but about the peace and fulfillment that comes from knowing I have lived my life with courage and integrity. I still remember the night I met Jack. It was at a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles, an event meant to raise funds for underprivileged children. I was there, as usual, working my magic as a jacketing consultant, helping clients find the perfect outfits for such occasions. The atmosphere was electric, filled with elegant gowns and dapper suits, and amidst all the glitz, Jack stood out like a beacon of charm. He had this disarming smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We struck up a conversation near the silent auction tables, and though we had different views on religion, something that usually sets the tone for future disagreements, Jack assured me it wouldn't be an issue. He was charismatic and seemed genuinely interested in my life. I found myself laughing more that night than I had in a long time. Our relationship blossomed quickly after that. Jack was a successful entrepreneur, known for his business acumen, and he was always full of stories about his work. It was clear he was driven and passionate, qualities I admired. After a year of dating, we decided to take the plunge and get married. Jack's family seemed to be as perfect as he was, and their acceptance meant a lot to me. Jack's father, Henry, was a prominent figure in Los Angeles. At 68, he had achieved tremendous success as the CEO of a well-known nonprofit organization. Henry was a man of principles, strict yet fair. His leadership had not only elevated the nonprofit's profile, but had also impacted many lives positively. Despite his formidable reputation, he was warm and welcoming when I first met him. Jack's mother, Margaret, was more reserved. At 65, she had a cautious nature, wary of who Jack brought home. But she was never unkind, just protective. I could tell she had high expectations, and while she didn't openly express her approval, I could sense her grudging acceptance. The first few years of our marriage were blissful. Jack and I settled into a comfortable rhythm, balancing our busy careers and personal lives. We had a beautiful home in Beverly Hills, a gift from Jack's family, and our social life was vibrant, filled with events and gatherings. Then, everything changed. Henry's sudden death was a jolt to all of us. I remember the day vividly. Jack had come home looking more solemn than I'd ever seen him. Henry's death was not just a personal loss. It meant a significant shift in the family dynamics, especially in Jack's life. I was expecting Jack to grieve deeply, to be consumed by the loss of his father. Instead, what I saw was troubling. He started coming home late, his eyes bloodshot and reeking of alcohol. He became distant and indifferent, not just towards me, but towards everything that once mattered. At first, I thought it was just his way of coping with the grief, a phase that would pass. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that something was fundamentally wrong. One evening, after yet another late night, I confronted him. "Jack, what's going on with you? You're not yourself," I said, my voice trembling with concern. He looked at me with a vacant expression. "Angela, I'm fine. Just need some time to myself," he replied, his tone dismissive. But I knew something was off. Jack's brother, Steve, who managed the family business, had started to show concern. He and his wife, Jessica, who had become a good friend of mine, were the only ones who seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Steve pulled me aside one day at a family gathering. "Angela, you need to know something," he said, his face lined with worry. "Jack isn't handling this well. I've noticed he's been drinking heavily, and he doesn't seem to care about anything anymore. It's like he's relieved Henry is gone. I was taken aback. Relieved? But why would he feel that way? Steve shook his head. I don't know, but it's as if he's freed from something. I'm worried about what's happening to him, and I think you should be too. The gravity of Steve's words hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's erratic behavior was more than just a reaction to grief. There was an unsettling shift in him, a change that was beyond the usual response to loss. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but replay the events in my mind. Jack's behavior, his indifference, Steve's revelation, it all pointed to something deeper, something I hadn't yet fully grasped. The man I had married, who had once been so charming and sincere, was now a stranger to me. And as the days passed, I feared that the foundation of our relationship, once built on trust and love, was crumbling faster than I could comprehend. The weeks after Henry's funeral were a blur of tension and confusion. I tried to keep our life as normal as possible, but Jack's behavior became increasingly erratic. I had hoped that time would heal his wounds, but it seemed to have done the opposite. Our once warm home now felt like a battlefield. One evening, while we were having dinner, Jack's phone buzzed incessantly. He ignored it at first, but eventually his frustration got the better of him. He snatched the phone off the table and stormed out of the room, leaving me to finish my meal in silence. I could hear muffled voices from the other room, but I couldn't make out what was being said. When Jack returned, he looked more agitated than ever. I've had enough of this, he muttered, slamming his phone on the table. I need some space. I tried to approach him gently. Jack, talk to me. What's going on? You can't just shut me out. He glared at me. It's not about you, Angela. It's everything. I just need to figure things out on my own. His words stung, but I didn't push further. Instead, I sought solace in conversations with Jessica. We'd become close friends over the past year, and she had always been a calming presence. I confided in her about my growing concerns. Jessica, I'm worried, I said one day over coffee. Jack's behavior is out of control. He's drinking heavily, and he's so distant. It's like he's a different person. Jessica's eyes widened with concern. Angela, you're not alone in feeling this way. Steve and I have both noticed it. There's something really wrong with him. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a lump in my throat. Jessica hesitated before speaking. Steve mentioned that Jack's been spending money recklessly. The foundation's funds, Jack's been using them for personal expenses. And I've heard rumors about him seeing escorts. My heart sank. Is that true? How could he do that? Jessica nodded. I'm afraid so. It's like he's spiraling out of control. And I'm worried about what this means for you. The betrayal cut deep. I felt a wave of nausea as I tried to process what Jessica had just revealed. Jack's father had dedicated his life to the nonprofit, and now Jack was tarnishing that legacy. How could someone so committed to helping others be so selfish? That evening, I confronted Jack again. I know what you've been doing, I said, my voice trembling with anger. Steve told me about the misuse of the foundation's funds. And I've heard about the escorts. Jack's face turned pale. Angela, Don't, I interrupted. Just don't. I can't believe you would betray everything your father worked for. And you didn't even have the decency to be honest with me. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I'm sorry. I thought I could handle it all. I didn't want to burden you with my problems. Burden me? I exclaimed. You're tearing our lives apart. I'm married to someone who's not only betraying his family's legacy, but also using me as a cover for his deceit. Jack slumped into a chair, his shoulders drooping. I'm sorry, he repeated, but his apology felt hollow. As the days passed, the rift between us widened. Jack's attempts to patch things up were feeble at best. He would come home with flowers or empty promises, but his actions spoke louder than words. The more he tried to win me back, the clearer it became that his motives were entirely self-serving. One afternoon, as I was packing up some of our things, Steve stopped by to check on me. How are you holding up? He asked softly. It's been hell, I admitted. I don't know how to move forward from this. Jack's behavior is out of control, and I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare. Steve sighed. Angela, I wish there was something more I could do. I'm afraid Jack's problems run deeper than just the recent events. There's a lot of unresolved anger and resentment. I know, I said. But it's not just about Jack anymore. It's about what's best for me, and I don't see a future with him the way things are. Steve nodded sympathetically. You deserve better, Angela. Sometimes, the hardest thing is knowing when to walk away. I had hoped that Steve's words would bring me some clarity, but they only reinforced the growing certainty that my marriage was beyond repair. The man I had once loved and admired was now a stranger, someone who had manipulated and betrayed me. The illusion of our perfect life had shattered, leaving nothing but the fragments of a broken relationship. As I stared out the window, watching the sunset over Los Angeles, I knew that my next steps would be crucial. The decision to leave was looming, but the thought of facing the truth about Jack's motivations and the impact on my own future was daunting. I was standing at a crossroads, and the road ahead was uncertain. Little did I know that the revelations and choices that awaited would push me to the edge and force me to confront not just Jack's darkness, but my own resolve to reclaim my life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of confusion and heartache. Despite Jack's attempts to smooth things over with grand gestures, I couldn't ignore the unsettling truth about his actions. Our once hopeful future was now clouded by his deceit and betrayal. It was early one morning when Steve called me. Angela, we need to talk, he said, his voice serious. I've set up a meeting with a family lawyer. There are some important matters we need to discuss. My heart raced as I made my way to the lawyer's office in Beverly Hills. The opulent surroundings contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside me. Steve and Jessica were already there when I arrived, their faces etched with concern. Angela, thank you for coming, the lawyer, Mr. Harris, began as I took a seat. We need to go over the details of Henry's will and the implications for you and Jack. I nodded, trying to steady my nerves. Mr. Harris pulled out a thick file and began flipping through it. As you know, Henry left behind a considerable estate. There's the family foundation, which Jack is heavily involved with, and then there's the inheritance. The mention of the inheritance caught my attention. I'd heard rumors about a substantial amount, but the specifics had never been clear. Jack's inheritance is conditional, Mr. Harris continued. He stands to inherit $17 million, but only if his marriage to you lasts 6 years. If the marriage ends before that, he forfeits the entire amount. I stared at Mr. Harris in shock. So, Jack's been staying with me just to secure this money? Mr. Harris nodded. It appears so. Given the circumstances, it's crucial for you to understand the full implications. There's a substantial sum of money that you are entitled to as well, without any conditions attached. Steve and Jessica exchanged worried glances. Angela, I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, Steve said. Jack's actions have been more than just reckless. They've been calculated. I took a deep breath, trying to process the gravity of what I'd just learned. The realization that Jack had been playing a long game with me to secure his inheritance felt like a punch to the gut. My marriage had been a facade, a means to an end. The meeting concluded with Mr. Harris outlining the next steps. I left the office feeling a mixture of anger and determination. I knew I had to confront Jack with this new knowledge and make some tough decisions about my future. That evening, as Jack stumbled into the house, reeking of alcohol, I decided it was time for a direct confrontation. I was tired of his excuses and empty promises. Jack, we need to talk, I said firmly. I know about the inheritance conditions and how you've been using me to secure it. He looked at me, a mix of surprise and guilt in his eyes. Angela, No more excuses, I interrupted. You've been deceitful from the start. The way you've manipulated me and used the foundation's money for your own pleasures, it's beyond forgiveness. Jack slumped into a chair, his face pale. Angela, I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could manage everything without dragging you into it. Manage, I said, my voice rising. You've been living a double life, Jack. And now, it's clear that the only reason you stayed in this marriage was for the money. Jack's expression shifted from guilt to anger. So, what if I stayed for the money? It's not like you've been perfect either. You've been holding me back. His words stung, but I was resolute. This marriage was supposed to be about trust and commitment. Instead, it's been nothing but a charade. I can't stay here any longer. He looked desperate now. Angela, please don't do this. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through it. I shook my head. It's too late for that. I'm done being a pawn in your game. I'm moving forward with my life, and I'm leaving you behind. Jack's attempts to plead with me were futile. I had reached the breaking point. That night, I packed up my things and prepared to leave. As I walked out of the house, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. It was the end of a chapter one had hoped would be filled with love and happiness, but instead, it had been marred by betrayal and deceit. In the days that followed, I focused on putting my life back together. I sold a house and started looking for a new place to live. My career as a jacketing consultant kept me busy, and I poured my energy into rebuilding my life. Despite the emotional turmoil, I found solace in my friends and the support they offered. Jessica was a constant source of encouragement, and Steve's understanding helped me navigate the aftermath of my broken marriage. As I settled into my new apartment, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. The experience had been painful, but it had also strengthened my resolve to value myself and not accept anything less than genuine respect and love. The weeks following my decision to leave Jack were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. As I settled into my new apartment, the weight of my old life began to lift, though the scars of betrayal still lingered. My focus was now on moving forward and finding my own path. One morning, as I was unpacking boxes, my phone buzzed with a message from Steve. It read, "Angela, can we meet? There's something important I need to discuss with you." I agreed to meet him at a local cafe where we had often gathered to talk. When I arrived, Steve and Jessica were already seated, their expressions serious but supportive. "Angela, there's been more fallout from the situation with Jack," Steve began, his voice steady. "The misuse of the foundation's funds has caused a lot of trouble. I'm working to sort things out, but it's been a mess." Jessica added, "We've also learned that Jack is facing legal trouble for his actions. The foundation is pressing charges for the embezzled money." I sighed. I can't say I'm surprised. Jack's choices were reckless, and now he's paying the price. Steve nodded. "It's a complex situation, but I wanted you to know that the family foundation is now in a good place. We're working to clean up the mess and ensure it continues to support the causes Henry cared about." It was comforting to hear that the foundation would recover and continue its important work. The realization that something positive was emerging from the chaos gave me a sense of closure. I thanked Steve and Jessica for their ongoing support and promised to keep in touch as I continued to rebuild my life. As I moved forward, I focused on my career and personal growth. My work as a jacketing consultant flourished, and I found joy in helping clients find their perfect looks. My new apartment became a sanctuary where I could create a fresh start, free from the shadows of my past. One afternoon, I received a letter from Mr. Harris, the family lawyer. It detailed the final settlement of the inheritance. The letter confirmed that, as part of the divorce settlement, I would receive a substantial amount of money, though not the $17 million Jack had forfeited. It was a significant sum that would provide a solid foundation for my future. The letter also included a note from Jack, which I hesitated to read. It was a brief apology, expressing remorse for his actions and wishing me well. I wasn't sure what to make of it. While it was a small gesture, it did little to change the hurt he had caused. Still, I appreciated the attempt at closure. My friends and family continued to be my pillars of strength. With their support, I was able to navigate the complexities of the divorce and the emotional aftermath. I also took the opportunity to explore new interests and hobbies, rediscovering parts of myself that had been overshadowed by the tumultuous relationship with Jack. As months passed, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I began volunteering for causes I was passionate about, finding fulfillment in giving back to the community. The experience of my past relationship had taught me the value of integrity and self-respect, and I was determined to live by those principles. I also took time to reflect on the lessons I had learned. The destructive impact of unresolved childhood trauma and resentment had been a harsh reality, but it had also highlighted the importance of recognizing one's worth and standing up for oneself. I realized that true love and respect could only come from a place of honesty and self-awareness. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, looking out at the city lights, I felt a sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but I had emerged stronger and more self-assured. I was no longer defined by the past or by the betrayal I had experienced. With a renewed sense of hope and determination, I embraced the future with open arms. The road ahead was full of possibilities, and I was ready to explore them. My story with Jack had ended, but my life was far from over. The lessons learned and the strength gained would guide me as I embarked on a new chapter, one where I would cherish my self-respect and integrity above all else. I've always loved San Francisco. There's something about this city that feels like it's constantly alive, bustling with possibilities and hidden stories. I'm Maya, a 30-year-old graphic designer, and my life here has been a blend of work, quiet moments, and unexpected turns. I live alone in a chic, modern apartment that I'm proud to call my own. It's not huge, but it's perfect for me. The best part is its location, just a short walk from the design firm where I spend most of my days. My job is my passion. I dive into my work with an intensity that often surprises me. Each project feels like a new adventure, a chance to create something unique and meaningful. On weekends, when I need to escape the buzz of the city, I head to a small park nearby. It's my sanctuary. The park isn't anything extraordinary, just a patch of green amid the concrete, but it's where I find peace. The tall trees and chirping birds offer a kind of quiet that's hard to find elsewhere in the city. It's here that I find solace and inspiration, a place where I can think and recharge. One crisp autumn afternoon, while I was enjoying the usual tranquility of the park, everything changed. I was lost in thought, sketching ideas for a new project, when a sudden commotion jolted me out of my reverie. I looked up to see a man sprawled on the grass, looking a bit disoriented. "Are you all right?" I asked, rushing over to him. The man, who looked to be in his mid-30s, blinked up at me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tripped over my own feet," he said with a sheepish grin. His name was Jake, and as it turned out, he worked in real estate. Jake had a charisma about him that was hard to ignore. His outgoing personality contrasted sharply with my more reserved nature. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other in the park. What started as casual conversations soon blossomed into something more. We went from chatting about the weather to sharing stories over coffee. Our weekends began to revolve around each other, and before long, our time together extended into late-night dinners and even full weekends spent exploring the city. Our relationship progressed quickly. It felt natural and exciting, but also a bit overwhelming. One day, Jake proposed that we move in together. I was caught off guard. The idea of merging my life with someone else's was daunting, but I couldn't deny how much I cared for him. After some thought, I agreed. We found a larger apartment in a new part of the city, one with bright rooms and an airy feel that symbolized a fresh start for us. Moving in together was supposed to be a new beginning, but soon I noticed cracks in our seemingly perfect life. It started subtly. Jake suggested that I should cut back on my work hours to focus more on our home and our relationship. At first, I thought he was joking, but as he continued to press the issue, I realized he was serious. I was taken aback. My work meant everything to me. It wasn't just a job, it was a big part of who I was. The thought of stepping back from my career felt like losing a piece of myself. I tried to balance both, but the tension was palpable. The situation was further complicated by Jake's mother, Mrs. Harrison, who lived nearby. She visited often, and her presence added another layer of stress to our relationship. Mrs. Harrison, a woman in her early 60s, was kind but had strong traditional views about gender roles. Her comments about homemaking and prioritizing family over work made me feel as though my career was being dismissed as insignificant. Jake seemed to align with his mother's views more and more, and the strain began to show. Despite the growing pressure, I tried to stay optimistic. I found myself constantly juggling between fulfilling my work responsibilities and trying to meet the expectations set by Jake and his mother. It was like walking a tightrope, and I felt like I was about to fall off. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I sat in our new apartment feeling overwhelmed. I realized that I was losing sight of myself. My independence, which had always been my strength, was slipping away. It was in this moment of clarity that I decided I needed to do something to preserve my sense of self while navigating this new, challenging phase of my life. And so began a silent act of rebellion. I made a decision to pretend that I had quit my job while continuing to work from home. I set up a separate savings account to stash away money for my freelance projects. It was a way to reclaim a part of my life, a small, private rebellion against the pressure I was feeling. Little did I know, this decision would set the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. I thought moving in with Jake would be a new adventure, a chance to build something meaningful together. But as the weeks turned into months, the excitement of our new apartment began to wear off, revealing underlying issues we hadn't fully addressed. Jake's suggestions about my career continued. He would casually bring up the idea of me reducing my work hours, always framing it as a way to enhance our relationship. "It would be nice if you could be around more," he'd say, his voice filled with genuine concern. "We could use more time together. Maybe even work on making our place feel more like home." At first, I tried to brush it off. I thought maybe it was just a phase. But the more he brought it up, the more I felt like my independence was being chipped away. Balancing my job with the demands of our relationship was becoming increasingly difficult. I loved Jake, but I loved my work too. It was a core part of who I was. Things took a turn for the worse when Jake's mother, Mrs. Harrison, started visiting more frequently. Her visits were always polite, but they carried an underlying tension. Mrs. Harrison had her own ideas about how a woman should prioritize her life, and it seemed her opinions were influencing Jake more than I realized. One day, as I was preparing dinner, Mrs. Harrison stopped by unexpectedly. She looked around the kitchen and made a comment that stung. "It's important to make a home feel warm and inviting. You know, keeping things organized and spending time on it can really make a difference," she said, her tone casual but her words heavy with implication. I smiled tightly, trying to keep my composure. "I agree, Mrs. Harrison. I've been working on making it a comfortable place for us." "Oh, I'm sure you're doing your best," she replied, but there was a note of disapproval in her voice. "Sometimes, though, it's better to focus more on creating a nurturing environment at home rather than being too engrossed in work." The conversation left me feeling frustrated and trapped. Jake and I had never discussed this level of interference from his mother, and it seemed like he was aligning with her traditional views more and more. I began to feel like an outsider in my own home. I tried to adapt. I cut back on some work hours and focused more on the house, but it felt like a part of me was shrinking. Despite my efforts, the strain between us grew. Jake would often bring up how my work was keeping me away from our relationship. "You're always busy, Maya. Can't you take a break?" he'd say. The final straw came one evening when we had a particularly heated argument. Jake was frustrated, and his irritation bubbled over. "You don't support me or our future," he yelled. "You're always prioritizing your job over us. This isn't what I envisioned for us." I was devastated. I felt like I was being pulled in two different directions, torn between my love for Jake and my passion for my career. It seemed like nothing I did was ever enough. The pressure was relentless, and I was running out of ways to keep everything balanced. In a desperate bid to retain some control over my life, I decided to take a drastic step. I began to pretend that I had quit my job. Behind closed doors, I continued to work on freelance projects, setting up a separate savings account to stash away the money I earned. It was a secret rebellion, a way to keep a piece of my independence while trying to meet the expectations placed on me. Even though this plan provided me with a small sense of control, it added another layer of stress. Keeping up the pretense was exhausting. I had to be careful about when and how I worked, always making sure not to slip up. The emotional toll was immense, and it was becoming harder to maintain the facade. Jake's growing frustration was becoming more apparent. The tension between us reached a breaking point during one of his drunken outbursts. He accused me of undermining his vision for our future, insisting that I conform to his and his mother's expectations. It was a painful confrontation that left me questioning whether this relationship was worth the cost to my own well-being. I started to realize that no matter how much I tried to please everyone, I was losing myself in the process. The facade of harmony was cracking, and beneath it lay the painful truth that something had to change. I had to make a choice, one that would require me to confront the reality of my situation and decide what I truly wanted for my future. The atmosphere at home was growing more oppressive. Every day, it felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to keep up the pretense of quitting my job while secretly working from home. The strain was taking its toll on me, and Jake's frustrations were becoming more frequent and intense. One evening, Jake came home late, his mood sour and his words sharp. He had been drinking, and it was clear that he was more than just tipsy. I could see the frustration in his eyes as he staggered into the living room. "Why are you still working?" he demanded, his voice slurring slightly. "I thought you were going to focus on our life together." I tried to stay calm. "I'm not working. I've told you, I'm focusing on us. I'm just tidying up some things." "Don't lie to me, Maya." His voice rose, and I could see the anger boiling over. "You're always working, always busy. What's the point of this if you can't even commit to us?" I was taken aback by his accusation. "I'm doing everything I can.
But this isn't just about me.
It's about us. I'm trying to balance both, but it's not easy." Jake's face flushed with rage. "Balance? It feels like you're always putting your work first. You're not supporting me or our relationship. You've changed, Maya." The words hit me hard. They were a reminder of everything that was wrong, of the constant pressure I felt to give up a part of myself for the sake of our relationship. But it wasn't just Jake's anger. It was his growing alignment with his mother's views that was causing the real conflict. His mother, Mrs. Harrison, had been visiting more often, her comments becoming sharper and more pointed. One day, while Jake was at work, she came by to discuss the progress of our new life together. She looked around the apartment with a critical eye, her disapproval evident. "You know," she said, "a woman's role is important in a home. It's about creating a warm and welcoming space. I hope you're not letting your work interfere with that." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I'm doing my best to balance everything, Mrs. Harrison." She nodded, but there was a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Well, it's important to make sure that your priorities are in the right place. A home needs a woman's touch." The pressure from Jake and his mother was relentless. It felt like I was being squeezed from all sides, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't meet their expectations without losing myself in the process. I was caught in a cycle of pretending and compromising, and it was beginning to break me down. The final confrontation came one night after a particularly intense argument. Jake was drunk again, his emotions raw and unfiltered. We were in the middle of a heated exchange when he suddenly shouted, "If you can't support me and our future, then what are we even doing here? I can't keep living like this." His words were like a knife to my heart. I felt a deep, crushing sense of realization. I couldn't keep living under this pressure. The constant struggle to maintain a facade, the relentless push to conform to someone else's expectations, it was all too much. In the heat of the moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Maybe you're right," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe this isn't working. I can't keep living like this." Jake's face showed a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" I nodded, feeling tears well up. "I can't do this anymore. I need to find a way to be true to myself. I'm sorry, but I need to leave." The look on Jake's face was a mix of shock and fury. "You're just going to walk away?" "I'm not walking away from you," I said, my voice firm despite the tears. "I'm walking away from a life that's making me lose myself." That night, I packed a few bags with the essentials and made arrangements to stay with a friend. The decision wasn't easy, and it felt like I was tearing a piece of my heart away. But deep down, I knew it was the only way I could reclaim my independence and start rebuilding my life on my own terms. As I walked out of the apartment, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The life I had tried so hard to build was unraveling, but in its place, I was beginning to see a glimmer of hope. I had taken the first step toward finding myself again, even if it meant facing an uncertain future. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I settled into a small apartment of my own, a cozy space that felt like a blank canvas for a new beginning. I returned to my graphic design work, and my colleagues welcomed me back with open arms. Their support was a balm to my soul, and it reminded me of why I had chosen this path in the first place. I threw myself back into my career with renewed passion. My work became a source of joy and empowerment. It was a relief to focus solely on projects that mattered to me, without the constant pressure to prioritize someone else's expectations. I started to explore new hobbies, painting, hiking, and even cooking, which had always been on the back burner. It felt exhilarating to rediscover parts of myself that had been overshadowed by my previous relationship. One day, while I was at a coffee shop, I ran into old friends. It was wonderful to reconnect with them and share stories about our lives. They were genuinely happy to see me and were curious about my new beginnings. It felt good to share my journey and receive their encouragement. It was a reminder that I had not only lost myself in the past relationship but also gained a new sense of clarity and purpose. Months later, Jake reached out to me. I was surprised to receive a message from him, especially since I had not heard from him since moving out. He was candid about his struggles, including losing his job and feeling lost without me. He expressed a desire to talk and possibly rekindle our relationship. I was tempted to meet with him, to see if there was any way to find closure or understanding. However, after reflecting on everything I had been through, I realized that my life had taken a new direction. I had found a stronger sense of self-worth and clarity about what I wanted. The idea of going back to a relationship that had caused me so much pain seemed like a step backward. When we finally met, Jake was visibly different. He seemed older, more worn out, and his demeanor was one of regret. He apologized for how he had treated me and admitted that he had made mistakes. But as we talked, I knew deep down that the relationship we had was not something I wanted to revisit. "I've changed a lot," Jake said, his voice filled with remorse. "I realize now how much I took you for granted. I'm sorry for everything." I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. "I appreciate your apology, Jake, but I've grown a lot since we parted ways. I'm in a different place now, and I need to keep moving forward." He nodded, understanding my decision. "I get it, Maya. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for." As I walked away from that meeting, I felt a profound sense of closure. I was finally free from the shadows of my past, ready to embrace the future with confidence. I had reclaimed my independence and learned to value myself in ways I hadn't before. My journey of self-discovery had been challenging, but it had led me to a place of personal fulfillment and happiness. The story of my life had come full circle, and I was ready to write the next chapter with a heart full of hope and a mind clear about what truly mattered to me. My name is Linda Harris, and I'm 48 years old. For most of my life, I thought I had everything figured out. I had a stable job, a comfortable home in Austin, Texas, and a family that I cherished above all else. My husband, David, and I had been married for over 20 years. We raised two wonderful children, Jake, who's 24, and Emily, who's 22. I thought we were living a normal, happy life, but life has a way of revealing truths that you'd rather not know. My story begins with the sudden death of my father. It was a cold morning when I received the call that changed everything. My father had been in a car accident, and he didn't make it. The news was devastating. My father was my rock, the one who had always been there for me. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. But what followed his death was something I could never have anticipated. My mother, who was in her late 60s, took my father's death very hard. She was never the same after that day. Not long after, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I was crushed. My mother had always been a strong woman, but now she was weakened by grief and illness. She needed me, and I knew I had to be there for her. David, my husband, didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. "Can't someone else take care of her?" he asked, as if it were a simple matter. But it wasn't. My brother lived out of state, and there was no one else to care for her. I decided to move back into my family home to take care of my mother during her final days. It was a decision I made without hesitation, but David wasn't pleased. David and I had been living in company housing, a benefit of his job. The rent was affordable, and it was convenient for his work. But my mother needed me, and the only way to care for her properly was to move in with her. I suggested that I could live with my mother for a while, but David was annoyed. "Who's going to cook? Who's going to clean?" he asked, more concerned about his own comfort than my mother's well-being. I tried to explain how important it was for me to be with her, but David's lack of empathy was becoming increasingly apparent. I moved in with my mother, and David grudgingly agreed to stay in the company housing, but it was clear that he was not happy about the arrangement. He didn't visit often, and when he did, his visits were brief and filled with complaints. During those difficult months, I watched my mother slowly fade away. It was heartbreaking to see her in such pain, but I was grateful for the time we had together. She often expressed her gratitude for my presence, unaware of the strain it was putting on my marriage. I did everything I could to make her comfortable, managing her medications, preparing her meals, and simply being there for her. As the months passed, I noticed that David's attitude was becoming more distant. He complained about the inconvenience of the situation, but I was too focused on my mother's care to confront him. I knew that things weren't right between us, but I told myself that once my mother was gone, we would have time to mend our relationship. My mother passed away peacefully in her sleep, just as the doctors had predicted. It was a devastating blow, but I took solace in knowing that I had done everything I could for her. My brother came for the funeral, and so did my children. It was a small, somber affair, and I couldn't help but notice that David and his parents were behaving strangely. During the funeral, David and his parents refused to sit in the family section, choosing instead to sit at the back of the room. I was hurt, but I was too overwhelmed by grief to say anything. After the service, I overheard them making comments about how burdensome it had been to attend. It stung, but I still didn't confront them. I wanted to believe that David was just stressed and that things would return to normal. But things didn't return to normal. After the funeral, I overheard a conversation between David and his parents that left me stunned. They were discussing the possibility of a large inheritance, $7 million, they believed, and how it could change everything for them. I was shocked. Where had they gotten this idea? My parents were not wealthy, and there was no such inheritance. It was at that moment that I began to see David for who he truly was. The man I had spent over 2 decades with, the father of my children, was planning something behind my back. But I didn't yet know the full extent of his betrayal. The $7 million inheritance was just the beginning of a series of events that would tear my family apart and force me to find a strength I didn't know I had. After my mother's funeral, I returned to the family home, feeling an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The house, once filled with memories of love and warmth, now seemed cold and hollow. But I wasn't prepared for what would come next. A few weeks passed, and David suggested that we should take a family trip. He handed me travel vouchers and said it might help me relax after everything I had been through. It seemed like a thoughtful gesture, something I hadn't expected from him given his recent behavior. I was surprised, but I wanted to believe that maybe he was trying to make amends, so I agreed. Before we left, I made a quick stop at Jake's place to visit him and his sister, Emily. I hadn't seen much of them while caring for my mother, and I missed them dearly. We spent some time together, and they were both pleased to see me. They were also surprised by David's suggestion for a trip, but like me, they hoped it was a sign that he was trying to turn things around. The trip itself was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I spent time with my children, soaking in the hot springs and trying to let go of the stress that had been building up over the past few months. But deep down, something felt off. David had stayed behind, saying he needed some time alone, which was unlike him. I tried to push the uneasy feeling aside, telling myself that it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. When the trip was over, I returned home with a renewed sense of hope, ready to face whatever came next. But as soon as I arrived, my heart sank. The family home was gone, wrecked beyond recognition. The place where I had spent so many years with my parents, where I had nursed my mother through her final days, was nothing but a pile of debris. I stood there in shock, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I couldn't understand why this had happened. Then, out of nowhere, David appeared with his parents, all three of them wearing smug expressions. David's words were cold and calculated. "Finally, I'm rid of that burden," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Starting today, my parents are moving in with me at our house." I could barely process what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Have you lost your mind?" But deep down, I knew exactly what was going on. They had wrecked the house, my family home, because they believed there was a $7 million inheritance waiting for them. David had assumed that by destroying the house, he could push me to claim this imaginary fortune and bring it to him. I stood there, feeling an intense mixture of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. I couldn't believe that the man I had shared my life with, the father of my children, had done something so cruel, all for the sake of money that didn't even exist. And the worst part was, David wasn't alone in this. His parents had been part of the plan from the start. They stood there, waiting for me to hand over the inheritance, but there was nothing to give. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. It was the kind of laughter that comes from utter disbelief, from the realization that everything you thought you knew was a lie. "There's no inheritance," I finally managed to say through my laughter. "You wrecked the house for nothing. There's nothing left." Their smug expressions quickly turned to confusion, then anger. "What do you mean, no inheritance?" David demanded, his face turning red. But I didn't answer him. I was done explaining myself. The truth was out, and there was nothing more to say. I walked away from the wreckage, leaving David and his parents to stand in the mess they had created. The house might have been gone, but I wasn't about to let them walk away from this unscathed. They had destroyed my home, my memories, and in return, I was going to take something from them. I immediately sought legal advice. The house had still been in my mother's name, and David and his father had no right to do what they did. As it turned out, they had used David's father's connections in the construction industry to carry out the wreckage themselves, without any legal permission. They had even given me those travel vouchers to ensure I was out of the way while they carried out their plan. It was clear to me that they had gone too far, and I was determined to make them pay for what they had done. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for my parents, for the memories they had left behind, and for the dignity that David and his family had tried to strip away from me. The battle was far from over, and I was ready to see it through to the end. When I walked away from the wreckage of my family home, I knew there was no turning back. The love I once felt for David was replaced with a resolve to fight for what was right. I couldn't allow him or his parents to get away with what they had done, not after they had destroyed everything I held dear, all for a non-existent $7 million inheritance. I met with a lawyer the very next day. As I explained the situation to him, he listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I told him about how David and his father had wrecked the house without any legal permission, his face hardened. "This is a clear case of property destruction, Linda," he said. "Not only can we hold them accountable for the damages, but we can also pursue compensation for the emotional distress this has caused you." Hearing those words gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in months. Finally, someone was on my side, someone who believed in my fight for justice. My lawyer moved quickly, filing a formal complaint against David and his father. They had crossed a line, and now they would have to face the consequences. A few days later, David received the legal notice. I wasn't there to see his reaction, but I got a taste of it soon enough when he called me, his voice filled with anger. "What's with this certified letter?" he shouted. "You're seriously going to sue me? We're family, Linda. This isn't how families treat each other." I couldn't believe his audacity. "Family?" I shot back. "Is that what you call what you did to me? Destroying my mother's house, thinking you'd get your hands on millions that don't even exist? You should be grateful I'm only suing you for damages. You have no idea how much you've hurt me." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought I had gotten through to him. But then he started making excuses, blaming everything on his father. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his tone shifting to something that almost sounded like regret. "Dad thought it was the best way to get things settled. I just went along with it." I wasn't buying it. "You went along with it because you were greedy, David. You didn't care about me, or my family, or anything other than that imaginary money." "Well, guess what? There's nothing to settle. You and your father are going to pay for what you did." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. I was done being the understanding wife. I was done letting David and his family walk all over me. I had spent too long putting everyone else's needs before my own, and now it was time to take care of myself. As the legal process unfolded, I discovered something even more shocking. Emily, my daughter, came to me one evening with her phone in hand. "Mom, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling with anger. She showed me a listing on a popular online marketplace. There, in full view, were my mother's belongings, her cherished possessions, the ones that had survived the wreckage of the house. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. "Who's selling these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Grandma," Emily said, her face pale. "She's selling everything that was left from the house. Dad must have given her access, and now she's just selling them like they're junk." I felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't enough for them to destroy the house. Now they were profiting off my mother's memories. I knew I had to act fast. I called the police, reporting the theft of my mother's belongings. My lawyer assured me that we could pursue charges for the theft as well, adding to the already mounting case against David and his family. The investigation moved quickly. David's mother's account on the marketplace was shut down, and the items were pulled from sale. I was able to recover most of what she had listed, but the damage was done. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. These were the people I had once called family, and now they were little more than strangers who had taken everything from me. As if this wasn't enough, the final blow came when David's father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I found out when David called me, his voice frantic and desperate. "Dad's dying, Linda. What am I supposed to do?" I was stunned by the news, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sympathy. The man who had wrecked my life was now facing his own mortality, and instead of feeling sad, I felt a strange sense of justice. "I don't know, David. Maybe you should reflect on how you treated my parents when they were sick. Maybe you'll find some answers there." David didn't say much after that. His father's death came quickly, and with it, the final unraveling of everything they had tried to build. In his will, David's father left his house to Jake, my son, an ironic twist, considering everything that had happened. Jake, determined not to let history repeat itself, decided to have the house demolished, just as David had done to my family home. The wreckage of that house felt like the closing of a chapter, one that had been filled with pain, but also with a newfound strength I never knew I had. David and his mother were left with nothing, no house, no money, and no family to support them. And as much as I wanted to feel sorry for them, I couldn't. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I, on the other hand, was ready to start anew, leaving the past behind and focusing on the future that lay ahead. In the weeks following David's father's death and the demolition of his house, I began to see everything in a new light. The destruction of my family home, the betrayal by my husband, and the theft of my mother's belongings had all taken a toll on me, but they had also revealed something important: my own strength. I had survived the worst of it, and now it was time to move forward. Jake, who had inherited his grandfather's house, made a decision that surprised me. "Mom," he said one day, "I'm going to build a new house on the land where Grandpa's house stood. I want you to come live with us when it's ready. You don't have to be alone anymore." His offer filled me with warmth. I had been living with Emily while everything was being sorted out, and as much as I loved my daughter, I knew I couldn't stay with her forever. Jake's fiancée was supportive of the idea, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a place where I truly belonged. I agreed to move in with Jake once the house was built. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild not just a home, but a life that had been shattered by greed and betrayal. I was determined not to become the kind of mother-in-law that David's mother had been. Instead, I wanted to be a source of support and love for my son and his future wife. As for David and his mother, they had fallen on hard times. With no house and no savings, they were forced to move into a small company-owned apartment. I heard from mutual acquaintances that they were struggling, but I felt no desire to reach out. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. The irony wasn't lost on me. David and his mother were now in the very position they had tried so hard to avoid by wrecking my family home. Meanwhile, I finalized the legal matters. David finally paid the damages and compensation from what little he had left of the inherited assets. The money didn't matter to me as much as the principle. It was a final act of accountability, something that had been missing for far too long. As I settled into life with Emily and awaited the completion of Jake's new house, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The $7 million inheritance that David and his parents had been so obsessed with had never existed, but the cost of their greed had been very real. They had lost everything: house, family, dignity, while I had gained something far more valuable: a new sense of purpose and a chance to start over. When Jake's house was finally completed, I moved in with him and his fiancée. The house was beautiful, filled with light and warmth, a stark contrast to the darkness that had clouded my life before. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I was no longer alone. I had my children, my new home, and the knowledge that I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. In the end, the past was behind me, and a new chapter was just beginning. And this time, it was one I was writing on my own terms. I often find myself reflecting on how my life took such a drastic turn. It's a story I've shared with few, but it's my story, one marked by abandonment, heartache, and a quest for identity. My name is Grace Thompson, and this is how my journey began. I was 10 years old when everything changed. My father, Robert Thompson, had lost his job as an auto mechanic, and with it, our family's financial stability crumbled. My mother, Linda, worked part-time as a cashier, but her income wasn't enough to cover our needs. The mounting bills and debts soon became too much for us to handle. I remember those days vividly. My parents were tense and distant, and the arguments were frequent and harsh. One day, without much warning, my parents told me that I would be going to live with my grandparents in Nebraska. "It's just for a while," my mother assured me. "Things will get better, and we'll have you back with us soon." I wanted to believe them. I really did. I packed a few belongings and left our small, cramped apartment with a mixture of hope and confusion. I wasn't sure why things had gotten so bad, but I clung to the promise that it would be temporary. When I arrived at my grandparents' small farm in rural Nebraska, the reality of my situation hit me hard. The farm was miles from the nearest town, isolated and quiet. My grandparents, in their 70s, greeted me with a forced cheerfulness that felt hollow. They were good people, but they were old and set in their ways. They tried to make me feel welcome, but their warmth did little to ease the coldness I felt inside. The months turned into years. Each day was a reminder of my parents' broken promise. I sent letters and tried calling, but my attempts were met with silence. The only response I ever received was a vague postcard now and then, saying that things were still tough and that they were working on it. The hardest part was feeling abandoned. My grandparents were kind enough, but their support was limited. They were busy with their daily routines and the demands of the farm. I felt like an afterthought, a burden they were forced to bear. They didn't know how to comfort me, and I didn't know how to ask for what I needed. The pain of being left behind festered in me, and I grew increasingly withdrawn. My loneliness grew deeper when I learned that my younger brother, Max, had been born after I left. I was told he was a bright, cheerful child who brought joy to my parents' lives. The news only deepened my sense of betrayal. Here was this new part of my family, growing up with my parents, while I was left alone, far away. Then came a turning point that shattered my remaining illusions. I was about 15 when I overheard a conversation between my grandmother and my mother on the phone. I had been trying to eavesdrop to catch any news from my parents, and what I heard made my heart sink. My mother was still alive, and she had been in contact with my grandmother all along. The realization was a gut punch. My parents hadn't been completely out of reach. They had chosen to keep me at a distance. That discovery was the catalyst for my decision to confront my past. I was determined to find out why my parents had abandoned me and why they hadn't tried to reconnect. But my search for answers was met with obstacles. My grandparents were tight-lipped, and any questions I asked only resulted in vague responses or more silence. When I turned 13, my Aunt Helen came into the picture. She was my father's younger sister, and she lived in Denver, Colorado. I didn't know her well, but my grandparents decided that it was time for a change. I was sent to live with Aunt Helen, and though I was apprehensive, I hoped that this new chapter would bring some relief. Leaving Nebraska was both an escape and a new beginning. Aunt Helen met me at the bus station with a warm smile and open arms. She was kind, patient, and seemed genuinely interested in helping me rebuild my life. Despite my fears and reservations, I felt a glimmer of hope. The isolation of the farm, the endless waiting, and the pain of abandonment were behind me. At least, that's what I hoped. My life with Aunt Helen was a stark contrast to my time with my grandparents. She gave me the space to heal, to start over, and to envision a future for myself. It was clear from the start that she wanted to help me, and she showed me a level of care and understanding that I hadn't experienced in years. This new phase of my life was the beginning of a journey toward finding myself and understanding my place in the world. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Aunt Helen's presence marked the first real step toward healing from the wounds of my past. I wish I could say that moving to Denver with Aunt Helen solved all my problems, but life is rarely that simple. While it offered me a fresh start, the pain of my past and the longing for answers followed me, shadowing every step I took. Aunt Helen was wonderful. She made sure I felt welcome and cared for. Her home was a stark contrast to my grandparents' farm, bright, bustling, and filled with opportunities. Helen was a high school teacher, and her nurturing nature extended beyond the classroom. She listened to me, encouraged me, and became my emotional anchor. Her support was exactly what I needed as I navigated the tumultuous teenage years. I started high school in Denver, and while I struggled with the emotional scars from my past, I began to find solace in my studies. It was during this time that I discovered my passion for dentistry. The idea of helping people, of being able to make a difference in someone's life, resonated deeply with me. Aunt Helen encouraged me to pursue this path, and it gave me a sense of purpose. Despite my growing interest in dentistry, the absence of my biological parents loomed over me. My parents' silence was a constant reminder of the abandonment I had endured. Every birthday, every holiday spent without them was a painful reminder of the family I had lost. When I turned 18, I made the decision to legally change my last name to Thompson-Hart, adopting Aunt Helen's last name. It felt like a necessary step to sever the painful ties to my biological family and to fully embrace the new life I was building. Aunt Helen was supportive of this decision, and it gave me a sense of closure. I was ready to move forward, focusing on my education and career aspirations. It was during my sophomore year in dental school that I overheard a conversation between Aunt Helen and my grandmother. I had been visiting my aunt's home during a break from school, and I was curious about a phone call Aunt Helen had taken in the kitchen. I had a bad habit of eavesdropping, but I was desperate for any information about my parents. From where I stood, I could hear Aunt Helen speaking softly to my grandmother. "You know, Grace overheard that conversation," Aunt Helen said, her voice tinged with concern. "She's still hurt by everything. I don't know how to explain this to her." The grandmother's voice, though distant, was unmistakably my mother's. My heart pounded as I strained to hear more. "I know, Helen," my mother said, "but we didn't want to upset her. We thought it was better this way." The revelation was staggering. My mother was alive. All those years of believing she had vanished were shattered by the realization that she had been in contact with my grandmother. The betrayal cut deep. If she was still in touch, why hadn't she tried to reach out to me? Why had she allowed me to believe she was gone? My emotions were a whirlwind. I felt anger, confusion, and an overwhelming need for answers. That night, I confronted Aunt Helen. Tears welled up in my eyes as I spoke, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did my mother let me believe she was dead? I need to understand what happened." Aunt Helen took a deep breath and looked at me with a mix of sympathy and sadness. "Grace, I didn't want to hurt you further. Your mother and father made some choices that were beyond my control. They felt that leaving you behind was the only way they could manage their situation. They thought it would be temporary, but things didn't go as planned." Her words did little to soothe the storm inside me. I felt as if my world had been turned upside down once again. I needed to know more, to confront my parents and hear their side of the story. But Aunt Helen's words also made me realize that finding answers might not be as straightforward as I had hoped. In the months that followed, I continued to focus on my studies, using them as a distraction from the turmoil within. I knew I had to confront my past, but the process was slow and fraught with uncertainty. The pain of being abandoned, the confusion of my parents' reappearance, and the quest for my own identity were all part of the tangled web I had to navigate. Though my heart was heavy with unanswered questions, Aunt Helen remained a steady source of support. She guided me through the emotional turbulence, helping me focus on my future. But the unresolved issues with my parents loomed large, casting a long shadow over my journey. The day I had dreaded for years finally arrived. It was a chilly morning in early autumn when my estranged family reappeared in my life, right when I was settling into my routine at the dental clinic. Denver's crisp air seemed to mirror the cold reality I was about to face. It started with a letter. I was sitting in my small apartment, going over patient records, when I noticed an envelope with my parents' return address. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, the contents sending a chill down my spine. The letter demanded that I provide financial support for them and my younger brother, Max, now 6 years old. They threatened legal action if I refused. The words on the paper seemed to mock the years of silence and the pain I had endured. I stared at the letter, a mixture of disbelief and anger swirling within me. How could they have the audacity to demand anything from me after all these years? After everything they had done, they had the nerve to come back into my life and expect me to help them? The betrayal was unbearable. I took the letter to Aunt Helen, feeling a surge of frustration and confusion. We sat at the kitchen table, the room feeling unusually cold despite the warm autumn sunlight streaming through the window. Aunt Helen's face was a mask of concern as she read the letter. "Oh, Grace," she said softly, handing the letter back to me. "This is awful. I'm so sorry you have to go through this." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. They just waltzed back into my life and think they can demand money? What gives them the right? They abandoned me. They left me to fend for myself. And now they want something from me? Aunt Helen nodded sympathetically. "I know it's hard, but you need to be careful. They might try to use the situation to manipulate you. You should consider seeking legal advice. Taking her advice to heart, I consulted with a lawyer. The legal process was daunting, but I was determined to fight back. My lawyer assured me that I had no legal obligation to provide financial support, and if they pursued legal action, we could counter with claims of their abandonment and neglect. I felt a small measure of relief knowing that I had some legal ground to stand on. But the legal battle was only part of the ordeal. My parents' reappearance triggered a wave of emotional turmoil. I was grappling with feelings of betrayal and anger. My parents, Robert and Linda, had seemingly forgotten the years of pain they had caused, and their sudden intrusion into my life was like a cruel joke. One evening, as I was leaving the clinic, I encountered Emily Foster, my sister-in-law. Her presence was unexpected and unwelcome. She had always been known for her childish behavior, but this time, her demeanor was particularly aggressive. "Grace, you're making a big mistake," Emily said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You're letting your bitterness drive you away from your family. They need your help, and you're being selfish." Her words were like a slap in the face. I was taken aback by her audacity. Selfish? After everything they've done to me? You have no idea what it's been like. I'm not going to let them use me again. Emily's face twisted in anger. You don't understand. They're struggling, and you're just going to turn your back on them? I tried to remain calm, but the encounter left me shaken. Emily's interference was just another complication in an already complex situation. The emotional strain was growing heavier with each passing day. Determined to regain control, I focused on preparing my response to the legal threat from my parents. I gathered all the documents and evidence of their abandonment, making sure to present a clear case. The process was exhausting, but it was necessary to protect myself from their demands. As I navigated the legal challenges, Aunt Helen was my rock. She provided a comforting presence, offering encouragement and practical support. We spent countless hours reviewing documents and strategizing our next steps. The legal confrontation, however, was only the beginning of a long and grueling process. My parents' attempts to pressure me continued, and the emotional scars of abandonment resurfaced. I was forced to confront the reality that my past was not something I could easily escape. Despite the turmoil, I remained resolute. I refused to let my parents' demands control my life. I continued to focus on my career and my well-being, determined to emerge from this ordeal stronger and more independent. The fight for my own sense of closure and justice was far from over, but I was ready to face whatever came next. The process of healing and self-discovery was ongoing, and as I moved forward, I hoped to find peace and reclaim my sense of identity from the shadows of my past. As the final days of the legal proceedings approached, the weight of my past seemed almost unbearable. I was exhausted, emotionally drained from the constant turmoil, but I was also determined to close this chapter of my life on my own terms. Denver was bustling around me, but my world felt like it had come to a standstill. The confrontation in court was intense. My parents' demands had been clear. They wanted financial support and were threatening legal action if I didn't comply. But my lawyer and I were prepared. We presented a compelling case, backed by the documents and evidence of their abandonment. It was clear to the court that their sudden reappearance was not a genuine attempt to reconnect, but rather a calculated move to gain financial support. In the courtroom, I faced them for the first time in years. My father, Robert, looked older and more defeated than I remembered, while my mother, Linda, had a resigned expression. The sight of them was unsettling. It brought back all the pain and confusion of my childhood. But this time, I was not the vulnerable little girl who had been left behind. I was an adult, a professional, and I had the strength to stand up for myself. The judge's ruling was a significant victory. I was legally absolved of any financial obligation to my parents. Their attempts to manipulate and control me through the threat of legal action had failed. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a profound sense of relief and liberation. The chapter was finally closing, and I could start focusing on my future. However, the resolution of the legal battle didn't completely erase the emotional scars. The process had dredged up old feelings of abandonment and rejection, and it took time to heal. I found solace in the support of Aunt Helen, whose unwavering love and encouragement had been my anchor throughout this turbulent period. One of the most difficult parts of moving on was dealing with Emily Foster, my sister-in-law. Her attempt to sabotage my life had reached a peak during a baby shower that was meant to be a celebration. She had caused a scene, making false accusations that led to a rift in the family. The fallout was messy, and it strained my relationship with the rest of the family. But even in the midst of this drama, Aunt Helen stood by me. She helped me navigate the situation, offering both emotional and practical support. We decided it was best to cut ties with Emily and distance ourselves from the chaos she created. It was a hard decision, but it was necessary for my own well-being. With the turmoil behind me, I began focusing on my life and my career. The dental clinic in Denver was my sanctuary. I poured my energy into my work, finding satisfaction and purpose in helping my patients. It was a stark contrast to the pain of the past, and it offered me a sense of normalcy and fulfillment. Gradually, I began to rebuild my life. The emotional wounds from my past were healing, and I started to embrace a future where I could focus on my career and personal happiness. The support of Aunt Helen was a constant reminder that I was not alone. Her love had become my foundation, and I cherished the bond we had formed. I also began to understand the importance of self-worth and independence. The ordeal with my family had taught me valuable lessons about resilience and the strength it takes to stand up for oneself. I had learned to trust my instincts and make decisions that were in my best interest. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of peace. The journey had been arduous, but it had led me to a place of self-discovery and growth. I was no longer defined by my past or the mistakes of my family. I was forging my own path, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. In the end, the story of my life was one of overcoming adversity and finding strength in the face of betrayal. My quest for identity and belonging had led me to a place of self-acceptance and independence. The trials of the past had shaped me, but they no longer held me captive. I was ready to embrace the future, with the knowledge that I had the power to shape my own destiny. My name is Susan, and I want to share a part of my life that changed everything for me. It's a story about family, sacrifice, and the struggle to hold on to who you are. I hope by telling it, you'll understand just how quickly life can spiral when responsibilities weigh too heavily on our hearts. It all started in Seattle, where Mike and I had crafted a comfortable life for ourselves. I was a 40-year-old graphic designer, and Mike was a software developer in his mid-40s. Our routine was predictable but cozy. We had a small, rented apartment with views of the city skyline, and our weekends were filled with hikes and relaxing dinners at our favorite spots. It was far from perfect, but it was our little bubble of happiness. Then everything changed. Mike's father passed away unexpectedly. The news hit us like a freight train. While we were mourning his loss, we were also faced with the stark reality of what was left behind. Mike's mother, Margaret, was a 75-year-old widow who had lived in the same large, old house for decades. It was a beautiful home, though somewhat gloomy and in need of renovation. The house had seen better days, much like Margaret herself. Mike was devastated. I watched as his grief turned into a fierce determination to take care of his mother. His sense of responsibility was strong, almost overwhelming. He felt that moving in with Margaret was the only way to honor his father's memory and support her through this tough time. To be honest, I was uneasy about the idea. Margaret and I had never had a smooth relationship. She was always critical, and her strict demeanor had been a source of tension between us. But Mike's plea and his palpable sense of duty made it hard for me to argue. So, we packed up our life in Seattle and moved into Margaret's old house. The transition was jarring. The house, though filled with memories, seemed to have an oppressive aura. The rooms were large but dark, and the air felt heavy with unspoken words. I tried to adjust, putting my own needs aside for the sake of my husband and his family. Living with Margaret was an ordeal. She had a way of making everything difficult. Her constant criticism of my cooking, my decorating choices, and even my habits began to chip away at my self-esteem. It wasn't just the criticism that hurt, it was the feeling of being trapped. Every day was a battle, and I felt increasingly isolated. Mike seemed distant, lost in his own world of grief and responsibility. His support was sporadic, and when I needed him most, he was often absent. His work, which used to be a shared part of our lives, became his refuge. I was left alone with Margaret's disapproval and the overwhelming sense of losing control over my own life. As weeks turned into months, the situation worsened. Margaret's health began to decline, and her demands increased. Mike, instead of stepping up, began to retreat further into his own space. It became clear that he was overwhelmed, and his solution to the problem was one I could never have anticipated. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, Mike came to me with a request that would alter everything. He suggested that I quit my job to become a full-time caretaker for Margaret. My heart sank at the thought. My career was not just a job, it was a part of who I was. The idea of giving it up was terrifying. "Susan, I know this is a lot to ask," Mike said, his voice strained. "But Margaret needs someone here all the time. I can't do it alone. I'm barely keeping it together, and I need you." I looked at him, trying to find the man I once knew in his pleading eyes. My career, my independence, and my identity felt like they were slipping through my fingers. But how could I refuse? The weight of responsibility and the love I had for Mike made it almost impossible to say no. So I agreed. I quit my job and devoted myself to taking care of Margaret. The shift was devastating. I felt a growing resentment as my own dreams and desires were pushed aside. The house became a prison, and Margaret's constant demands left me feeling drained and unfulfilled. And then there was the growing suspicion that something was off with Mike. He had become more secretive, more withdrawn. The cheerful promises and reassurances he had given me seemed to be unraveling. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much more complex and painful journey. As I tried to navigate this new life, a sense of betrayal began to creep into my thoughts. Mike's insistence on this arrangement was beginning to feel like a manipulation rather than a shared sacrifice. Little did I know, things were about to take a turn I couldn't have imagined. After I had reluctantly agreed to become Margaret's full-time caregiver, the initial relief of having made a decision soon turned into a painful realization of my new reality. My days became a monotonous cycle of managing Margaret's needs and coping with her ever-critical demeanor. I felt like I was living in a constant state of anxiety and discontent. Margaret's criticism was relentless. No matter how much effort I put into caring for her, it was never enough. Her disapproving remarks about my cooking or the way I managed the house made every day feel like a struggle. The things I had once taken pride in, like my creative touch with home decor or my knack for making meals, were now sources of frustration. It was as if no matter what I did, I could never meet her standards. Mike, on the other hand, seemed more distant than ever. His role as a software developer kept him occupied for long hours, and when he was home, he was often preoccupied with his own thoughts. His absence left me alone with Margaret and the growing resentment I felt towards the situation. Every night, I'd lie in bed and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. The dreams I once had about a fulfilling career and a happy life seemed to be slipping away. The situation came to a head one night when Mike came home unusually late. I was exhausted from a particularly trying day with Margaret, and the last thing I wanted was a late-night discussion. Yet, Mike wanted to talk. We sat down in the dimly lit kitchen, and he began to speak, his voice tinged with frustration. "Susan, I've been thinking," he said. "This isn't working. Margaret needs more help than I can provide, and I think you know it too. I looked at him, trying to keep my voice steady. What are you saying, Mike? I'm already doing everything I can. I've given up my job and my independence for this. He rubbed his eyes and sighed. I know it's hard, but I think we need more help. We can't keep doing this on our own. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the realization that we were both stuck in a situation that was spiraling out of control. Mike's suggestion that we hire additional help was a temporary fix, but it did nothing to address the root of the problem. Our marriage was deteriorating, and the strain was taking its toll on both of us. As if things weren't complicated enough, I began to notice some troubling behavior from Mike. He was more secretive about his finances, and I found myself growing increasingly suspicious. One evening, while Margaret was napping, I decided to take a look at some of the documents that had been lying around. What I discovered was shocking. Mike had been using Margaret's savings to buy a luxury condo for himself. I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me. How could he do this? The money that was supposed to be used for Margaret's care was being spent on a new apartment? My heart pounded as I struggled to process this revelation. It felt like everything I had sacrificed for was being thrown back in my face. I confronted Mike that night, my anger barely contained. I found out about the condo, Mike. How could you do this? You're using Margaret's money for your own gain. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. Susan, it's not what you think. I needed to make some investments. It was a business decision. A business decision? I snapped. We're talking about money meant for your mother's care. How could you think this was okay? The argument that ensued was one of the worst we'd ever had. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust and the foundation of our marriage. I felt more isolated than ever, trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to escape. Despite the growing tension between us, I continued to care for Margaret. She began to show some signs of appreciation, perhaps realizing that I was the only one truly looking after her. But even this newfound warmth was short-lived. Margaret's health began to deteriorate rapidly. One morning, she suffered a severe stroke, and the days that followed were filled with hospital visits and uncertainty. Margaret's decline was swift and heartbreaking. The once critical mother-in-law who had made my life so difficult was now frail and vulnerable. As I watched over her, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had endured was leading to a devastating conclusion. The final blow came with Margaret's passing. The funeral was a somber event, but it was far from the end of the turmoil. I was left to grapple with the emotional fallout and the revelations that were still to come. The day of Margaret's funeral was one of the hardest I've ever faced. The solemnity of the occasion was compounded by the bitterness that lingered in my heart. I had spent so much time and energy caring for her, and now, in the aftermath of her passing, the only thing I wanted was closure and some semblance of peace. Instead, I was about to uncover more layers of betrayal and deceit. Mike and I barely spoke during the service. His demeanor was distant, and he seemed preoccupied with his own thoughts. I couldn't help but feel that the chasm between us had only grown wider. The strain was evident in the way he avoided eye contact and in the tense silence that hung over us. It was clear that our marriage was on the brink of collapse, and I felt more alone than ever. The real shock came at the reading of Margaret's will. The lawyer's office was filled with an air of cold efficiency as we gathered to hear Margaret's final wishes. Mike and his sister, Rachel, were there, their faces set in expressions of barely concealed anticipation. I, too, was curious, though my feelings were mixed with anxiety and dread. The lawyer began to read the will, and the room fell silent as he spoke. To my beloved daughter-in-law, Susan, he began, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the family home and all financial assets. It is my wish that Susan will use this inheritance wisely and in the best interests of her future. I was stunned. The lawyer's words seemed to echo in my ears as he continued reading. Margaret had left everything to me and had completely disinherited Mike and Rachel. My heart raced as I tried to process the gravity of the situation. What did this mean for Mike and me? Mike's face turned pale as the lawyer read the final lines. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and anger. Rachel, too, seemed taken aback, her eyes narrowing as she processed the news. There was no mistaking the resentment that was now directed at me. After the meeting, Mike and Rachel confronted me. "Susan," Mike said, his voice tight with emotion, "how could she do this? I'm her son. I should have received something." I struggled to keep my composure. "I didn't know about this. I'm just as surprised as you are." Rachel's voice was icy. "You must have had something to do with this. There's no way Margaret would have left everything to you without some influence." I shook my head, trying to remain calm. I didn't do anything to influence her decision. She made her choice, and I have no idea why she did it. The confrontation left me feeling shaken. The accusations and the anger from Mike and Rachel were overwhelming. I was now the sole beneficiary of Margaret's estate, but it came at the cost of a shattered relationship with my husband and his family. As I began to sort through the estate, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions. The house, once a source of tension and discomfort, now felt like a burden. The financial assets were substantial, but the weight of the responsibility was heavy. I had spent years dreaming of a different life, and now, with this inheritance, I was faced with choices I hadn't anticipated. The days following the will reading were filled with a whirlwind of activity. I was busy handling Margaret's affairs, trying to make sense of the estate, and dealing with the fallout from the will. Every decision seemed to be tinged with the bitterness of the past few months. Mike's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He seemed determined to make my life as difficult as possible. He refused to speak to me except to express his frustration and anger. The once loving relationship we had was now reduced to a series of heated arguments and bitter exchanges. One evening, as I sat alone in the house, I realized that I had to make a decision about my future. The inheritance had given me financial security, but it had come at an enormous personal cost. My marriage was in ruins, and my sense of self-worth was at an all-time low. I needed to figure out what I wanted and how to move forward. In the midst of this turmoil, a part of me began to see a glimmer of hope. Despite everything that had happened, I had the chance to rebuild my life. The inheritance was a symbol of something more, a chance to reclaim my independence and start anew. But before I could fully embrace this new possibility, I needed to confront the reality of my situation. Mike's betrayal and the collapse of our marriage had left me feeling lost and uncertain. I was left with the daunting task of deciding how to move forward, knowing that my decisions would shape the rest of my life. The truth was clear. I needed to find a way to heal and reclaim my own sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with the potential for new beginnings. The aftermath of Margaret's death and the fallout from the will had left me in a whirlwind of emotions. I had faced betrayal, loss, and profound change, but now, standing on the threshold of a new life, I had to decide how to move forward. Mike and I had reached the breaking point. After the will reading, he became more distant, his resentment bubbling to the surface in every interaction. One night, after a particularly heated argument, I knew that our marriage was beyond repair. The trust and love we once shared had eroded, leaving only the remnants of what we had once been. The decision to divorce Mike was painful, but it became clear that it was necessary for my own well-being. The betrayal I had experienced was not just a breach of trust, but a complete abandonment of the commitment we had made to each other. I filed for divorce, and though the process was emotionally draining, it was also a step toward reclaiming my own sense of self-worth. In the midst of this upheaval, I began to take stock of my life and the future I wanted to build. The inheritance from Margaret provided me with financial security, but it was up to me to determine how to use it. I decided to sell the large, old family home. The house, once a symbol of duty and sacrifice, had become a reminder of the pain and disillusionment I had endured. Selling it felt like shedding a layer of the past and making space for something new. As the house was put on the market and the final details of the divorce were settled, I started to envision a new future for myself. I found a cozy apartment in a different part of Seattle, one that was vibrant and full of possibilities. It was a small but comfortable space that felt like a fresh start. With the financial freedom from the sale of the house and the inheritance, I decided to pursue some of the dreams I had put on hold. I enrolled in a few art classes to reignite my passion for graphic design and started working on personal projects that had been buried beneath the weight of caregiving and marital strife. The creative outlet was a balm for my soul, helping me to rediscover the joy and fulfillment I had once found in my career. The journey to reclaiming my independence wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt and sadness, but there were also glimmers of hope and renewal. I learned to appreciate the small victories and the gradual process of rebuilding my life. The relationships with Mike and Rachel were irreparably damaged, but I began to focus on nurturing connections with friends and building new, supportive relationships. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, reflecting on the past few years, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Despite the challenges and the heartbreak, I had managed to find a path forward. The inheritance from Margaret had been a turning point, not just in terms of financial stability, but as a catalyst for personal growth and self-discovery. As I moved forward, I was no longer defined by my past sacrifices or the pain of betrayal. Instead, I embraced the future with a renewed sense of purpose and independence. The journey had been arduous, but it had also led me to a place of strength and self-worth that I had longed for. In the end, I realized that the true measure of my journey was not just the material gains or losses, but the resilience and courage I had found within myself. I was ready to face the future on my own terms, with a heart that was finally open to new possibilities and a spirit that was free to explore the life I had always dreamed of. I remember the day I married Mark Thompson as if it were yesterday, though it feels like a lifetime ago. I was just 20, and the arranged marriage was a decision I never felt I had a choice in. My parents had always believed in tradition, and for them, this union was a perfect match. Mark was the eldest son of the Thompson family, who owned a successful textile company in Chicago. At that time, it seemed like the ideal arrangement, a blend of security and social standing. Looking back, I see how naive I was. Mark was 5 years older, a man who had always been favored by his parents. They saw him as their golden child, and I was merely the wife they had chosen for him. From the start, there was an unspoken tension between us. Mark wasn't unkind in the traditional sense. He was just indifferent, a man whose attention was rarely on me. Our home was large and comfortably furnished, a testament to the wealth Mark's family had accumulated over the years. But the grandeur of the house didn't extend to our relationship. The walls of our home seemed to echo with the emptiness of our marriage. In the early years, I tried to find my place, hoping that somehow things would change. I had dreams of my own, of working, of contributing something meaningful beyond the walls of our home. But Mark was adamant. He feared that if I worked, it would reflect poorly on us. "People will think we're struggling," he'd say dismissively. So, my ambitions were shelved, and I became a housewife, bound to the expectations set for me. The real hardship began when Mark and I faced infertility. It was a topic we rarely discussed, but the strain was palpable. Mark's parents were particularly cruel. They'd call me a barren woman behind my back, a term that cut deeply. Mark, instead of defending me, seemed to retreat further into himself. His lack of support felt like another weight around my neck, tightening with each passing year. As the years went by, I felt more like a stranger in my own home. The constant reminders from Mark's family about my inability to bear children were relentless. They'd never miss an opportunity to make me feel inadequate. I tried to keep my head up, to keep my spirits alive, but it was a losing battle. Then, everything changed in an instant. Mark's father, the patriarch of the family and the owner of their $100 million textile company, died in a car accident. It was a devastating blow, but it was nothing compared to the shock that followed. During the legal proceedings, it was discovered that the company had been evading taxes for years. The revelations sent us spiraling into financial ruin. Our luxurious lifestyle was suddenly a thing of the past. We had to sell off assets, and our once grand home felt like a prison. Mark found a new job, thanks to connections my parents had, but it wasn't the same. The loss of our wealth cast a long shadow over our already strained marriage. We were no longer the well-to-do couple we had once been. The strain of financial difficulties only made our relationship worse. Then, as if things weren't bleak enough, Mark's mother had a stroke. It was a cruel twist of fate that fell upon me. Mark, who had always been more interested in avoiding responsibility, pushed the burden of caring for his ailing mother onto me. I had to juggle caring for her, managing the household, and dealing with Mark's distant and unkind demeanor. It felt like a cruel joke. My life had become a series of sacrifices with no end in sight. I remember one particular evening, a few months before my 55th birthday. Mark had always known how much I loved pottery. It was my escape, a way for me to express myself and find solace. But one day, while I was out, he decided to take it upon himself to destroy my pottery supplies. When I came home and saw the wreckage, my heart broke. It was the final straw. Years of neglect, cruelty, and now this. My passion reduced to rubble. It was at that moment that I began to seriously consider divorce. I had reached a point where I couldn't endure the misery any longer. But before I could make any plans, life threw another curveball. My parents, who had always been my source of support, passed away suddenly. Their deaths were a devastating blow, but they left me an inheritance of $1.5 million. The inheritance, however, was tangled in legal red tape. Mark, ever the opportunist, saw it as a chance to gain control. He tried to access the funds and even left me a divorce form, hoping to settle the matter quickly. But the money was not immediately accessible due to the bureaucratic process. Mark's plan was thwarted, but the situation had opened a door I had been too afraid to walk through. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come from those early days of my marriage. The house in Chicago that was once a symbol of our success had become a cage. And as the inheritance was being tied up in legalities, I found a glimmer of hope. My freedom was within reach, and I had to decide whether to grasp it or let it slip away. As I approached my 55th birthday, a sense of resignation had begun to settle in. My marriage had long been a source of pain and disillusionment, and Mark's indifference and cruelty had worn me down. The destruction of my pottery supplies was the breaking point. It was clear to me that my dreams and passions were being suffocated, and I could no longer ignore the toll it was taking on my soul. After my parents' unexpected deaths, I was left to navigate a maze of legal procedures to access the $1.5 million inheritance they had left me. The inheritance was meant to be my escape, a way to finally claim some semblance of independence and control over my own life. But Mark, ever opportunistic and driven by greed, saw it as a chance to secure his own future, even if it meant exploiting my loss. I remember vividly the day Mark confronted me about the inheritance. We were in the living room of our Chicago home, a space that had grown cold and unwelcoming over the years. Mark, with his usual air of arrogance, tried to intimidate me into surrendering control of the inheritance. "Pamela," he said with a sneer, "this money is rightfully ours. You wouldn't want to drag this out, would you?" His words felt like a slap in the face. I had always been the one to absorb his insults and disregard, but now he was trying to take something that was rightfully mine. I could barely contain my anger. "This money is my inheritance, not yours. You have no right to it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark's face reddened with frustration. "You're being unreasonable. We need this money to fix our situation. You know that." I shook my head. "No, Mark. This is my chance to make things right for myself. I won't let you take it from me." Despite my defiance, the inheritance was tied up in legalities that would take time to resolve. Mark's attempts to access the funds were thwarted, but his actions revealed just how far he was willing to go to exploit me. It was a wake-up call, one that forced me to confront the harsh reality of my marriage and my own desire for freedom. As the legal proceedings dragged on, I began to plan my escape. I knew I couldn't stay in the house where I had been so miserable for so long. It was a constant reminder of everything I had endured. I made the decision to move into my family home, a place that held memories of better times and provided a sense of refuge. Preparing for the move was both liberating and daunting. I had to sort through years of belongings, decide what to take and what to leave behind. The process was cathartic, allowing me to shed the weight of my past and prepare for a new chapter in my life. It was during this time that I discovered a letter from my late mother-in-law, tucked away in a drawer. The letter was a revelation. It instructed that a significant portion of her estate, including valuable jewelry, was to be passed on to me. My mother-in-law had always been distant and cold, but her final gesture was a surprising act of kindness. It felt like a small victory amidst the turmoil. I moved into my family home, a place that felt like a sanctuary compared to the prison of my previous residence. The transition wasn't easy, but it marked the beginning of a new era. I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as I settled into my new surroundings. The house was filled with the echoes of my childhood, but it was also a place where I could start to reclaim my identity. The legal issues surrounding the inheritance continued to linger, but my decision was made. I began the process of finalizing the divorce from Mark. It was a difficult and emotional process, but I was determined to see it through. The thought of finally being free from the chains of my marriage was both exhilarating and terrifying. Throughout this period, David Thompson, Mark's younger brother, reappeared in my life. David had left the family after college, and I hadn't seen him in years. His return was unexpected and brought a new dimension to the situation. David reached out to me, expressing his concern about the family's affairs and offering support. His presence was a reminder that even amidst betrayal and conflict, there were still people who cared and were willing to help. As I continued to navigate the complexities of my situation, the weight of the past slowly began to lift. The legal battles, the emotional scars, and the remnants of my old life were all part of a journey toward a new beginning. I knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The possibility of freedom and happiness was within reach, and I was determined to embrace it, no matter the obstacles. My life was in upheaval as I settled into my family home, trying to adjust to the new normal. The emotional and legal turmoil from my divorce and inheritance battles were relentless, but I was determined to move forward. It was a strange feeling, living in a space that was both comforting and alien, and I struggled to find a semblance of normalcy. The turning point in this chaotic period came unexpectedly. Mark, sensing that his control over me was slipping away, became more brazen in his efforts to reclaim his hold on my life. It was one particularly cold evening when his actions revealed just how far he was willing to go to manipulate the situation. He barged into my new home, his face flushed with anger. Pamela. Mark's voice echoed through the empty rooms. I've had enough of this charade. You think you can just walk away with all that money and leave me with nothing? I had been sorting through old family photos, trying to reconnect with my past. His outburst was jarring, and I felt a mix of dread and determination. Mark, this is my home now. You have no right to come here and threaten me. Mark's eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth they once held. You think you're so clever, don't you? But I'm not letting you get away with this. I'm going to take what's mine. His threats were not empty. I had already discovered that he had been trying to gain access to the inheritance money, using every legal loophole and deceitful tactic he could find. Despite his attempts, the money was still tied up in legal processes, and he was growing desperate. Then came the day that revealed the full extent of Mark's deceit. I had just finished dealing with a pile of paperwork related to the inheritance when I received a phone call from my lawyer. He informed me that Mark had submitted false claims to the court, attempting to forge documents to make it seem as if the inheritance was jointly owned. This was not only illegal, but a direct violation of the trust one had placed in the legal system. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. Mark was actively working to undermine my efforts and secure what he believed was rightfully his. The betrayal stung deeply, but it also solidified my resolve to fight back. I gathered all the evidence I had, determined to prove Mark's deceit and protect my hard-earned freedom. Amidst this, another surprise emerged. David Thompson, Mark's younger brother, reached out to me again. His return wasn't just a fleeting gesture of support. He genuinely wanted to help me navigate this difficult period. David's involvement was a ray of light in the growing darkness, and he offered practical assistance as well as emotional support. David's reappearance was timely, and his presence was a comforting reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. He had kept a low profile for years, but now he was actively engaged in helping me combat Mark's underhanded tactics. We worked together to counteract the false claims and to ensure that Mark's attempts to subvert the legal process would fail. As I faced these challenges, another unexpected twist occurred. I learned that my late mother-in-law had left me a significant portion of her estate, including some valuable jewelry. This revelation was both surprising and bittersweet. It was as if, in her own way, she had acknowledged my suffering and was offering me a measure of comfort and vindication. The discovery of this letter and the contents of the estate were a validation of my struggles. It was a gesture that, despite the complexities of my relationship with Mark's family, acknowledged my enduring resilience. The jewelry and other assets were not just material possessions, but symbols of the acknowledgement and respect I had long been denied. As I continued to grapple with the fallout of Mark's schemes and the emotional toll of my experiences, I began to see a glimmer of hope. The legal battles were not yet over, and the process of finalizing my divorce was still ongoing, but I felt a newfound strength. The combination of David's support, the recognition from my mother-in-law's estate, and my determination to reclaim my life fueled my resolve. It was clear that Mark's attempts to control me were failing, and his efforts to sabotage my freedom were ultimately in vain. The final stages of our legal separation were approaching, and with each passing day, I felt more confident about the future. I was on the brink of a new chapter, one where I could finally leave behind the shadows of my past and embrace the possibility of a better, more fulfilling life. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt empowered and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. My journey toward freedom was far from over, but I was determined to see it through, no matter the obstacles. The day finally arrived when my divorce from Mark was finalized. It was a bittersweet victory, a culmination of years of suffering, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. The courtroom was behind me, and I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. It was time to reclaim my life and move forward. As I settled into my family home, the space began to feel more like a refuge than just a place to live. The transition was not seamless, but each day brought a small victory. I rearranged the furniture, hung up new curtains, and even started a small garden in the backyard. Little by little, I was transforming the house into a home, a space where I could finally be myself. One afternoon, as I was unpacking some old boxes, I stumbled upon a collection of pottery supplies. They had been untouched for years, kept away in storage while I endured Mark's disdain for my hobbies. I felt a pang of sadness, but also a spark of excitement. This was a chance to reconnect with a part of myself I had neglected for too long. I set up a small studio in the corner of the living room. The first few attempts were clumsy, but as I got back into the rhythm of shaping clay and painting, I felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. It was a small, personal victory, but it represented a larger reclaiming of my identity. I realized that I could still pursue my passions and find joy in the simple things. David Thompson continued to be a supportive presence in my life. He was a true friend through the legal battles and the emotional aftermath of my divorce. His reappearance had been unexpected, but it was clear that his intentions were genuine. We spent time talking, reminiscing, and occasionally sharing meals. His kindness was a soothing balm for the wounds of the past. One day, David visited with a smile on his face and a small envelope in his hand. Inside was a letter from my late mother-in-law, confirming that she had left a portion of her estate to me, including some valuable jewelry. It was a gesture that added a sense of closure and acknowledgement to the tumultuous years I had endured. I was grateful for this final, unexpected gift from a person whose actions had, in their way, validated my struggles and resilience. Mark had tried to reach out to me several times, but each attempt was met with my firm refusal. He was desperate to reconcile, but I was resolute. I had spent too long in the shadows of his control, and there was no turning back. I knew that my decision was right, even if it came with a tinge of sadness. With my newfound freedom, I began to explore opportunities one had once only dreamed of. I enrolled in a pottery class at a local community center and started meeting new people. The connections I made were refreshing and invigorating. I felt alive in a way I hadn't for years. As I moved forward, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The hardship, the betrayal, and the eventual triumph were all part of a larger story of resilience and self-discovery. I had faced immense challenges, but I emerged stronger and more self-assured. Looking ahead, I embraced the possibilities that lay before me. The future was filled with potential, and I was ready to seize it. The pain of the past was fading, replaced by a sense of hope and excitement for what was to come. My journey had taught me that it is never too late to reclaim one's life and find happiness, even after years of suffering. In the end, I found solace in knowing that my story was not just one of survival, but of triumph and renewal. I had faced the darkest moments and emerged into the light, ready to embrace the freedom and joy that awaited me.